Sam, why are you hiding? Sam, why prolong the inevitable?
Until Dawn is a third-person horror adventure game that follows 8 teenagers who are lured back to a snowy mountain where their friends died the year before.
Why kid yourself into thinking you can get away? Don't you know I can smell you, Sam? I can smell your fear.
Atmosphere. The whole game is suspended on a thin layer of tension that's brought about by the suspenseful music and the cinematic look to the game. Its movie style is done really well, and many locations from the creepy mines to the derelict sanatorium are so richly detailed and vaguely spooky that it's easy to get lost in them. There's a lot of small things at play that keep the atmosphere going, from the wind being audible in nearly every part of the game, providing a low rumble to back the events, to the dialogue choices which can either make drastic or imperceptible changes to the story, and then the constant threat of QuickTime events. Even things like camera angles make things more ominous as characters disappear down long winding corridors or into increasingly darkened mine shafts. It feels like the atmosphere doesn't go very deep even in the game's most frightening moments and locations, but it doesn't really let up either, maintaining its surface level of suspense the whole game, even in moments of relative peace. That's one Harry Mason.
No! Oh, God! Jessica! No, Jessica. No, Jessica.
Scares. The game's scares aren't hugely original and many of them can be cheap and predictable, but I never left feeling disappointed with what the game delivered. That being said, there are so many moments where the characters play pranks on each other just to have a jump scare for the player in an otherwise slow chapter, and the early parts of the game are full of these moments. A lot of them are laughable in the most endearing way. It really goes back to slasher movies of the 2000s with more drawn out runtime, and the more often I replay the game, the more fun a lot of the jump scares become. The chase sequences are sort of hit and miss, with certain characters having plot armor for most of the game, meaning that QuickTime events are more entertaining to fail than they are to pass. But for a lot of characters without plot armor, it's pretty intense trying to make the right decisions, and some of the options that lead to better outcomes for characters often have more difficult to complete QuickTime events. My favourite aspect of the game is how Until Dawn uses the motion controls of the PlayStation 4's controller to measure if the player is moving. It's unique and used so infrequently that it's genuinely frightening. From my observations, it seems that sometimes the controller moves on its own, so you can't just place it on the floor and instantly win the section, which is a great way to force the player to do it. These sections are often in life and death scenario and puts real pressure on the player not to make mistakes. Until Dawn scares aren't exactly unique and very rarely impactful, and whilst it has some interesting features, they're not really enough that doesn't come off as silly or predictable to give it the point. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The soundtrack elegantly switches between the cinematic with disturbing and ominous sweeping orchestral pieces and creepy chimes and eerie melodies that even give what would be otherwise boring sections a feeling of tension. The music hypes up to a frantic high during chase sequences and action sequences where the orchestra just goes wild with plucking strings and scratching noises. In the background there's always the sound of wind blowing, indoors or out, and the low rumble really feels like it adds more tension to the atmosphere. The game tends to emphasize creepy moments with low rumbling strings, and this is another technique used in movies to make certain moments feel creepier than they actually are. But in my opinion it does work quite well, along with the loud stabs that accompany jump scares. That's sometimes a little too loud, but that's almost certainly the point. The sound effects are extremely crisp, with everything from the sound of snow crumpling underfoot to the screams of wild animals being immaculate and realistic. The voice acting is done really well, with a wide variety of characters, from the analyst's foreboding words of wisdom, to Chris who's always making jokes, and Emily's whose personality comes across as abrasive.
I would like to understand your feelings toward people who fear the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, and other intangible forces beyond the veil. Do you share this fear?
The sound space is pretty good, but there's not a huge need for directional audio, but they've gone and done it anyway, which is always nice. The sound design is really top grade stuff. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. Until Dawn's gore is sickeningly detailed, and there's a fair amount of variety, with the best part about it being the many deaths the characters can have at the fate of the player. From twisting heads off to being cut in half, the deaths, like many old school slasher movies, are fun to watch, with the caveat of sacrificing a character you may like. As mentioned before, a few characters have plot armor, but they can all die before the end of the game. There's a lot of other things in the game too, from some of the best looking blood to some seriously creepy bodies with unnerving details, amputated pigs' heads, and lots of other things. The gore isn't a huge focus of the game, which is good, but when it does crop up it's usually very impressive. That's 3 Harry Masons.
Before we begin, there are a few things I need to make sure you understand. You see, no one can change what happened last year. The past is beyond our control. You have to accept this in order to move forward.
Story. The game begins with a group of teens playing a prank on their friends that goes gravely wrong and ends up killing Beth and Hannah Washington in an unforeseen accident. Exactly a year later, they're summoned back to the mountain by Josh, the brother of the 2 sisters, who's insistent that they put the events of the past behind to have a good time. Unfortunately, that's not how things go. Until Dawn's story is one of the most entertaining in any of the horror games I've played, for the sheer amount of content and variety that makes it up. There are an overwhelming number of clues that can lead to dialogue between characters, newspaper clippings that reveal things dating back to the 1950s, and even a documentary that's pieced together when you gather enough of the totems.
Sometime after, the prospectors came to mine this mountain until a cave-in trap.
The characters themselves are likable enough to not want them to die, but there's also enough friction between them to make things interesting when they interact. Some of the dialogue can be cheesy, but it's still entertaining nonetheless. The biggest selling point is obviously the butterfly effect, which allows choices made to impact the events of the story, and even after playing the game through 6 and 7 times, I still find randomly new dialogue sections and events that I've just never seen before. There's a lot of different storylines going on at the same time, and constantly switching characters feels like you never get bored of one thing before something new crops up, with the overarching question being what's really going on in the mountain. The analyst sections allow the player to make choices that will impact the story later on or change the way things are represented, and each part with him is very intense and mysterious. On the other hand, there's some minor flaws with the way things are done that I'm not a huge fan of. The totems provide premonitions into possible futures as a warning, which can spoil upcoming events in the game. I've never thought these were an especially good idea and would have preferred if they just left the events as surprises. Also, the game will often leave pivotal changes to the story, down to whether the player can find specific items scattered throughout the game or not, which can be frustrating if you don't know what you need and where to find it to get the outcome you're after. Really though, Until Dawn is mostly as entertaining as it is because of the replayability the unique choose-your-own-adventure format provides. It's as fun to play through now as it was the first time I played it, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Until Dawn is not the best horror game ever made, but it's one of the most consistently entertaining with its shape-shifting story and likeable yet fun-to-kill characters. It's like being the director to your own slasher movie, it only gets more interesting with each playthrough. It remains one of the most replayable horror games I can think of.
That's what I say.
Hope everyone's excited for Halloween this year. I've recorded this in May and hope that by October the lineup is still looking good. Not every video for the month is going to have these outros because there's just so many to do, but thanks for watching and stay tuned for what's coming up next. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I didn't save everyone, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer and advise you don't either. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. You can always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Fatal Frame, or Project Zero Maiden of the Black Water, is a third-person horror game where you play as Yuri, Ren, and Miyu as they try and stop the mysterious suicides and disappearances taking place on Mount Ikami. Atmosphere. There's a lot of varying feelings that come from different sources in the game. Firstly, there's the deeply creepy and unsettling cutscenes and their found footage style. They're somehow unnerving to view, like you're seeing something you shouldn't be. In my opinion, most of the best content in the game is found in the cutscenes, and it's something they've always been very good at. Actually walking some of the environments can be intensely creepy, with places like the Shrine of Dolls giving off a feeling of being constantly watched. The haunting stares of various soulless dolls is very piercing, but not many other areas manage to invoke the same feelings. There's graveyards and woods with ominous names, but so many of them are vaguely eerie but unremarkable that it makes places like the Shrine of Dolls and Garden of Hanging Women really stand out. A lot of the disturbing feelings that you get throughout the game are generated by the story, and many items that are just strange to begin with take on a new light as their purpose is revealed later in the game, to the point where simply seeing one of the many black boxes made me uneasy. Every now and then you'll get a chapter with Ren using the antique shop security cameras to keep an eye on the girls, and the game is again playing to its strengths with a lot of creepy moments and well-designed footage, which made looking into the security cameras feel tense as you waited to see something. Sadly though, the game suffers from a similar problem to Fatal Frame 3, with a lot of meandering around large areas with nothing much in them, or lots of backtracking through areas for no real reason, and the atmosphere really wanes the more you have to go back through areas you've already been through. It also splits up the chapters with game menus where you can use your points to purchase more items, but it really takes you out of the moment since you spend quite a lot of time in them before going on to the next chapter. The fixed camera angles are gone in favour of third person, but it seems more of a loss than a gain. There's also some conflicting tones in the earliest chapters with a hazy summer sun glowing through the windows of a burnt out house, but the music is very cold and eerie in Fatal Frame style, and the two sort of cancel each other out. The game is a bit inconsistent, with some things being brilliantly creepy and others fading the atmosphere away to almost nothing. Though this does seem to improve into the later game, and ultimately the atmosphere is still there no matter how weak. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. Fatal Frame once again uses taking pictures of ghosts as its main mechanic for inflicting horror, but I found this time around that the ghosts just weren't as creepy or frightening, with only one or two exceptions. Many of them were unremarkable or similar to previous games, but there are a lot of women in flowing robes that came off as beautiful rather than menacing or evil. The actual gameplay itself is much easier with features that allow you to lock onto ghosts and track them, and an abundance of special powers in the camera, checkpoints, healing items, and the opportunity to buy more film in between chapters. The game even lets you hold multiple mirror stones which fully restore your health when you hit 0, and in previous games you were limited to only 1, meaning you never really had to bother picking up items. Picking up items though is a gameplay mechanic in itself, with the chance of being grabbed by a ghost if you don't let go in time. I didn't find this frightening, and it kind of annoyed me more than anything since all it really did was waste time. The game has chase sequences where you run away from an unkillable ghost, which isn't the first time they've tried this, but the ghost can kill you in one hit and teleport in front of you, meaning that you can run straight into it and die instantly, which just made the part frustrating. The game also has a wetness mechanic where the wetter your character's clothes are, the more likely you are to encounter ghosts. This is kind of bizarre and I'm not sure why it's there, but again the ghosts just aren't very creepy or scary to fight besides the eponymous Maiden of the Black Water and the ghost groom Kazuya. The game does try to include some more interesting powers that the ghosts have, with one of the most memorable ones being the old woman who forces to play a character into a black box, and if they can't take a fatal frame on her, then she closes the box and it's game over. It's kind of upsetting to be in this situation, but it's quite easy to get out of it. Where I personally found a lot of the horror came from again was the story side of things, with a lot of unpleasant concepts and spooky folklore stories that were oddly chilling, from girls being forced to become what the game refers to as a pillar, to the unearthly ghost marriages. Many of these concepts, once explained, were just haunting. The game misses the mark and has changed a lot of the original gameplay features that made taking pictures of ghosts so frightening. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The game borrows a lot from previous entries in the series, with similar ghostly drone pieces and chilling synth howls. There's a lot less variety, but a lot of the audio cues from previous games make a comeback here. The most impressive feature by far is the jump up in quality of sound design when fighting ghosts. When locking onto a ghost, you can hear a glorious cacophony of water bubbles, rumbling, static, voices, and the ghosts themselves talking, and it's frankly hypnotic and incredible. It changes for each ghost as well, with Kazuya's being the most unsettling, with the sound of metallic rattling filling the air, a noise like foil being crumpled continuously. I personally found it very unpleasant. So many of the sound effects are taken directly from the PlayStation 2 games that they almost feel out of place in this game, but their quality to make things spooky is undeniable and lends a little familiarity to the game. They're all soaked in the same heavy reverb that they were back in the PlayStation 2 era. The voice acting is a little forced and there's a major lack of emotion, which is sadly nothing new for the series, but there's a lot of reasons for characters in this game to feel hopeless, and whether it's intentional or not, the voice acting usually reflects this. The directional audio is very impressive and the reverb works perfectly in all of the environments. The sound design either improves solidly on its predecessors, or they're literally the same, which isn't a bad thing. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. Besides, in a cutscene and one very specific ghost, there's not a great deal of blood in the game, which makes sense. What is in the game is honestly quite surprising, and one of the most bloody acts I've seen in a Fatal Frame game to date. It really stands out, but it's in an optional cutscene, so it's not something everyone is going to witness. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. The story follows the 3 characters, Yuri, Ren and Miyu, who all arrive on Mount Ikami, which is famous for its suicides. They all arrive for different reasons and end up converging due to the draw of the mountain to seek their own goals. I found the folklore a lot easier to understand in this game over the actual plot, and the creepy backstories and rituals are an all-time high in this one, with some of the most deeply unsettling stories that are downright weird and creepy to read and see the corresponding cutscenes. The diary entries are a little overwhelming, and even with color-coordinated and numbered diary entries, it was difficult to tell who was saying what, but the content of the diaries really spoke for themselves. One of my favourite additions to this game was being able to touch a ghost after defeating it to see a cutscene of how it died, and some of these were absolutely brilliantly done. The plot itself was very confusing, and it was difficult to tell why certain things were happening and what some characters hoped to achieve with their bizarre actions. People came and went, and characters were just ditched in the late game. Some chapters felt frustratingly slow, and little happened in long periods of time. There was no real feeling of escalation of the stakes or any kind of urgency, and even in the last chapter it managed to drag things on unnecessarily. The game brings back Miku from Fatal Frame 1 once again, and she has maybe 2 or 3 sentences of dialogue before the game's over. I found the endings for Ren and Miyu to be underwhelming, to say the least, but at least Yuri had a decent ending, although she had the slowest chapters. The backstory is some of the best in the series, but the main plot really needs trimming, pacing, and some more satisfying endings, making the score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. The game keeps on doing something brilliant, followed by either not doing anything at all or stalling for time. Even the tried and true ghost fights felt more of an inconvenience by the late game, and with such slow moving plot it was difficult to convince myself to come back to play more of it. Maiden of the Black Water is a mixed bag, or maybe a black box that's only full half of the time. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
I have no idea, but something has to be done about this. Like I said, something has to be done about this. You can't go on this way. Yeah, you're damn right I can. Yeah. Well, someone has to do something. It's not like you're doing anything about it. It'll work. I bought everything I need.
Unforgiving, A Northern Hymn is a first-person horror game that follows Lynn, who awakens tied up in a car.
God damn it, it's dark.
Atmosphere. The game opens with a car crash and dumps the player in the deep end as you've got no idea what's going on. With no backstory to lead up to the events, it's sort of bewildering and easy to feel like a third wheel for a lot of the early game, as Lynn and her brother have a lot of history that you're just not told about. But it doesn't take long to start experiencing some of the eerie, electrifying moments as the pair go for a long walk through the woods in hopes of finding a way back to the road. Soon the two are separated and the atmosphere really intensifies when Lynn is left to fend for herself. Walking through swampland or darkened, murky woods with nothing but seemingly recently abandoned huts and creepy ambient music to keep you company fills a lot of the early game with apprehension since you don't know what to expect. Its tension building is pretty great. It explains so little and blends the fantastical with the realistic so effortlessly that it's easy to get sucked in. The game continues to be mystifying as it keeps going, with a lot of seemingly unrelated things that layer on top of each other, from partially submerged houses, weird radio transmissions, to supernatural entities like giants and shadow people making their presence known. The magical is embraced so fully by the end that it feels like reality has just been pushed aside as you're swept up in the dark fairy tale. Pushing forwards feels like Lynn will never surface into reality again. The atmosphere is never very strong, but it layers on a lot of interesting things with finesse. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game slips in some jump scares here and there, and there's a lot of electrifying scripted events that are mostly executed really well because there's a long gap between each one. It paces them very cleverly, mostly using banging noises or auditory cues to get you to freeze in place in case something's actually there. The scripted events are especially well done, with so many putting you into difficult situations and then subverting expectations or leading to jump scares, like the carriage section where it puts an enemy right in front of the carriage, and even if you outmaneuver it, it gets the last laugh. On the other hand, the game also tries to do chase sequences, and I somehow managed to beat the game without dying once, because it seemed to be very easy to lose the enemies and they didn't pursue me very far. Your luck may vary, but I found the enemies were just unable to find or catch me. They weren't very frightening either way, and their poor ability to sense or chase me didn't help. The game has a light mechanic similar to Amnesia Rebirth, but the game is far more generous with its light resources, and I felt general less fear of anything happening to me while I was in the dark. Another mechanic has you playing a harp to unlock doors and sections where you're actively hiding from enemies, makes playing the harp feel incredibly foolish, but you have no choice but to do it to progress. The game also likes to put you in difficult gameplay situations as well, with sneaking around a room full of enemies multiple times, like the room full of Bloodsuckers in Call of Pripyat, but Unforgiving maximizes the dread by making you do it for much, much longer. Unforgiving isn't a very long game, and its scares are pretty spaced out. Even with the enemies seemingly having no chance of catching me, there was more than enough frightening moments to keep the game going. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The music is a combination of synthy pulses and suspense pieces, with high-pitched whines and eerie, heavily reverberated drones that play constantly throughout the game. The game brings in thudding drums and percussion to emphasize the danger of the chase, and it works in hyping up those parts of the game. The harp playing is accompanied with glassy synth notes, and it really makes fusing the thing feel more magical. And the satyr also plays haunting melody on the violin, which is always strangely hypnotic but eerie to hear. The sound effects are pretty great, with lots of different things working together to bring the environments to life, with a lot of things being used to provide either sudden jump scares or unsettling moments, like the sound of a fly buzzing in your headphones. But where the game really excels is the voice acting, with Lucas and Lynn sounding realistically like a brother and sister. They interact really well. The antagonist of the game is a little too over the top for me, but his lines are incredibly sinister regardless.
This isn't happening. It's a dream. Just a bad dream. This isn't possible. Not possible.
Something that surprised me greatly was how creepy the Shadow Men and other monsters sounded, with their strained breathing noises being unpleasantly laboured, and also the gremlin-like creatures being creepily high-pitched and animal-like, and the pained screams of Lucas when he gets trapped under a rock are just painful to listen to. The directional audio is also incredibly good and allows you to get through a lot of the areas where the light is low, or where there's a lot of enemies. In my opinion, the sound design is just nearly flawless. That's 3 Harry Masons.
Holy hell, it's getting closer! Come on! Hurry, across the bridge! Don't stop!
Gore. The game itself isn't very gory, with only a few moments worth mentioning, but the shock value of Lucas dying and then having to remove his eyes for a puzzle is extremely uncomfortable and will haunt the player long after the game ends. The sickening way it's done as well, with Lynn's whimpering and Lucas's pained whines, makes an already difficult scene even harder to endure. The gore is brief, but if you remember anything about this game in a year's time, it'll be this. That's 4 Harry Masons.
Hello, it's Lucas.
Story. The game opens with a car crash, with Lynn breaking free from being captive, kicking Lucas in the head and causing the incident. After surviving the crash, Lucas explains that Lynn has some kind of addiction, which is why she was bound. The story sort of fades out for quite a long time, with only strange diary entries on the lore of other characters who inhabited the area before mysteriously vanishing, filling the void in as Lynn is tasked to bring the harp to the mysterious satyr, which persists until the game ends and then brings it all back into a loop. The game is pretty short, and not much can be expected in around 2 hours, but it's unclear if anything you did had an impact, or if it's all a fever dream because of Lynn's supposed addiction or something similar. The story keeps building mystery that doesn't feel like it paid off. There's enough story to be intriguing to learn more, but there's never any answers for anything that I could find, which left me feeling underwhelmed. Making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Unforgiving is only 2 hours long, and it uses that time really well. Just the story either needs fleshing out or a better explanation. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion of horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace. The Glass Staircase is a third-person survival horror game about a group of girls living in a sinister boarding school with a dark secret. Atmosphere. There's a wind blowing through the grey, foggy light of the boarding school's derelict halls, and the tone is set immediately. It feels like it's inspiration of old 60s Italian horror films mixed in with elements of Resident Evil, with camera angles and door opening screens, and Silent Hill's impending dread. The feeling that something's wrong is unmissable, but it's difficult to pinpoint which part of the numerous warning signs is the most concerning problem. The diary entries are all unsettling because they keep on alluding to something horrific going on in an almost apocalyptic way, and the speaker system tells you to take your tablet and go do your chores like you're in a prison camp. It's dreamlike, it's unreal, and then you open the front door, see something, and you're moved on to the next day, playing as a different one of the helpless girls trapped in this surreal place. The later game goes off into the deep end with dread-soaked atmosphere as you descend into the basement to find out what's going on. The game is split into two parts, with the first being an incredible build-up to the second part that feels like you're taking things into your own hands, but you aren't ready for what's going on below the boarding school. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The early game scares are mostly jump scares and startling moments in cutscenes, and these are usually accompanied by an over-the-top loud noise. And they do feel a little cheap, but the dread that surrounds the event usually makes up for it. The enemy designs for the main antagonist are a little underwhelming and seem to be a one-for-one copy of a Resident Evil boss, but there's something deeply disturbing about the zombie-like creatures near the end of the game with their almost animal-like faces and melted skin. There's a few chase sequences and they do not work very well with the fixed camera angles, but this does include a lot of dread since the game's autosave points are very sparse and failing will send you back quite a long way. The combat encounters are more intense for the same reason. Even with infinite ammo and auto-aiming gun, the camera angles and tank controls make the narrow corridors and large amount of enemies difficult to deal with. The game isn't very long, and while some things didn't hit the mark in its short runtime, a lot of things did. That's two Harry Masons. Sound design. There's not a lot of music in the game, but the select pieces are pretty impressive. From an unsettling piano that bends up and down like someone pressing on a record player, to the monotonous drone with hypnotic analog synths that sounds like insanity. In the final parts of the game, the music ramps up to an almost hellish dirge of voices as the boarding school burns down, and it's really climactic, and it's incredible to behold. The game's music is supported by a lot of ambiance, from the almost distorted wind blowing to the over-the-top volume of the rain, and there's something about the volume that makes it seem more intense and unnatural. The clock bell sound is also so distorted that it's off-putting, and a lot of the sound effects are like that, unnaturally loud or distorted. Many of the other sound effects are stock, and there's not too many of them, so it's not very noticeable, and it didn't personally bother me at all. There's no voice acting to worry about, with everything being done in text. The directional audio seems to cause problems when changing the camera angles, leading to the music glitching, but only for the piano, which is a little odd. Overall, the sound design, though basic, has enough unique choices and quality components to really enhance the game and its atmosphere. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. There are rooms full of bodies and hanging bloody corpses to portray the kind of things going on in the boarding school basement. On top of this, anytime you get hit in the game, your dress is covered with blood, and it stays there until you die or reload the game. Blood fills the edges of the screen to signify damage as well, but despite all of this, the gore never feels excessive and feels appropriate. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. The game starts you with pretty much nothing, opening with a title role and the boarding school's ominous vibes. The speaker system tells you to take your tablet and the game begins. The story as told in the diary entries is really suspenseful and dramatic, with it being split between the story of the wife Juliet, who's concerned about her husband as things escalate beyond her understanding and control, and her husband, a doctor who returned from the First World War to the English countryside and recluses himself into the basement to find a cure for the Spanish flu. The story dips into cliché territory a few times, but the writing in the diary entry is so apocalyptic in its scope and mysterious in its nature, with the highlight being Juliet's hopeless plea for normality, that it genuinely had me excited to read the next one. There's a little bit of environmental storytelling that kind of mixes in with the gore, but it's pretty blunt, but ultimately doesn't matter that much. The game's ending is pretty sad and reminds you of the cost of your character's success. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst it has a few extremely minor flaws, I found the game to be an incredible mix of engaging storytelling and atmospheric dread. The way the game is split up really works wonders for its pacing, and the way it ends is frankly incredible. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
Man, what a horrible way to die. What is that? A disease? I hope it's not contagious.
Overblood is a sci-fi survival horror game where a man wakes up from cryogenic freezing to find himself alone in a strange place. Atmosphere. The game's atmosphere is one of mystery and isolation, with the main character Raz exploring the cold, sterile environments of the unknown place he wakes up in. You have no idea what's going on for a lot of the early game, and the 90s experimental music and PlayStation 1 graphics give the whole place a lonely and creepy vibe. There's no sign of anyone, and there's obvious structural damage to the place. The computers keep saying that something has gone wrong, but it's unclear what. The mystery of what's going on sustains the game for a lot of its duration, and after finding a dead, mutated body in an elevator, things take a sinister turn. Though some of the early game's tense atmosphere is ruined by Raz's robot ally Pipo, who keeps on relentlessly making beeping noises every time it's around you, and after you meet Millie, the atmosphere takes another bit of a dive again, as they stop quite a lot to talk about things, which is the only real time the story makes an appearance.
No! Stay away! Oh! I thought you were... that thing.
I can't tell you how relieved I am. I'm so glad to find another person.
The game is only really creepy thanks to the way things look and sound, with the added mystery of not knowing what's going on. And for a lot of the later game, its atmosphere is really struggling to keep on being creepy. But for the early game, it's very impressive, even if it isn't very deep. That's 1 Harry Mason.
I'm a dead man.
Scares. Overblood tries its hand at jump scares, but none of them really seem to land. The enemies themselves were creepier when they weren't alive, and fighting them is a real pain because of the combat being just awkward and unsatisfying. Though the optional first-person perspective may have improved this if the combat wasn't so janky. The game has ammunition and health management, with bullets and healing items being essential for later fights, and not having these can make the game pretty much unwinnable, since the only way to find them is to crouch down and push X on everything. Since none of them are visible when exploring, it can make the game a little tedious as well. The closest to being frightening the game gets is its environmental dangers, like water overflowing in the sewer area or jumping over large gaps and precarious surfaces, and sometimes they're only frightening because the controls are again pretty janky. Overblood isn't really here to scare the player, and when it tries, it's not very good at it. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The music is incredibly 90s, with whirling synths and reverb-soaked whistling noises and flutes that play sometimes nonsensical melodies. It's very spacey, with an excessive amount of reverb on a lot of the tracks, and they give off a haunting, sinister vibe. The more basic ones have a menacing electric piano, vocal choirs and strings, and they provide a feeling of reflection and mystery as it gets lost in the reverb. The music is very impressive, and it gives a lot to the environments even if they repeat the tracks a lot. Sound effects are also reverb laden, and the silence that follows every door opening is incredibly tense. Overall, they're full of appropriately 90s noises that makes things like navigating the item menu feel alien and strange. The voice acting is a bit hit or miss, but it feels like most of it is a dialogue problem, and I'm unsure if there were translation problems or not, but what they're reading feels sometimes poorly paced or just awkward, but it's not as bad as some of the other games of its era. There's a ton of reverb on everything, and it's fantastic. Everything from footsteps to using items has an unreal depth to it that makes the station feel infinite. The game doesn't really utilize directional audio, but there's not much of a requirement for it in this game. Overall, the sound design goes a long way to help the lackluster graphics. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. There's not really any gore in the game, and I'm not sure it needed any, but the bodies you find early on that are suffering from the infection are oddly creepy, with their scaled grey skin, and they're strange enough to generate yet more mystery. The game didn't need any gore, and what it has instead still feels appropriate. That's 3 Harry Masons.
What is this place? How did I get here? I can't remember. I can't remember myself. My gosh, I don't even know who I am.
Story. The story begins with Raz awakening in the cryogenic chamber and placing a memory chip in a robot he calls Peepo. As the game goes on, he meets Millie, and the two try and uncover the mystery of his origins and the history of the place that they're in. The mystery that's generated at the start intrigued me a great deal, and the first time you find a body in an elevator, I was seriously enjoying what was happening and couldn't wait to find more. But the story has a major plot twist that it didn't do a very good job at hiding, and as a result I anticipated it several hours before its reveal. I found the story of finding a cure for Raz after he gets infected to be a bit uninteresting, and the dialogue didn't make it any better. There's no gameplay consequences to it, and because of it, there's a real disconnect between the story and the game. For a game that builds a mystery so well, its payoff is kind of lackluster, making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Overblood isn't much of a horror game, and its horror elements don't leave much of an impact. It's a spooky adventure, but one I admit I actually quite enjoyed. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
Hello? Hello? Oh, thank God you're alive. I need you to stay calm. We're going to get you help. We'll get you out of there. I want you to find a place to hide. Someplace safe where you can remember the taste of her kiss when you felt her neck break, you diseased cocksucker.
Outlast 2 is a first-person horror game that follows Blake Langerman, who becomes stranded in the territory of a brutal religious cult when his helicopter crashes and his wife goes missing. Atmosphere. It becomes obvious very quickly that the rural village the helicopter crashes near isn't welcome to strangers, and it feels like its dwindling population are avoiding you. There's a lot of paranoia as it feels like you're being watched. The first rotting corpse of a horse peeking out from under a blanket with its side split open is enough to make your stomach drop. The game spends the first 20 minutes building tension slowly with how eerie it is until the first enemy encounter. There's a lot of tension as you explore the village with the overbearingly hostile NPCs that roam around and attack you on sight. It feels like you're constantly pushing your luck as you go further and further into cult territory. The depravity is what seems to be the main feature of the game, and it's pretty nasty to begin with corpses and remains scattered everywhere, but it wears thin after a few hours and it's all but irrelevant by the end. The school flashbacks feel eerie also, since the whole place is uncannily quiet, but you know you aren't the only one that's there. The atmosphere is unpleasant, creepy, and eerie, but it's the electrifying tension that keeps it going, with every new area keeping you on edge as you anticipate new threats from the overwhelming apprehension that comes with trying to find a way out of them. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. There's quite a few sporadic jump scares that go through the game, with some being sort of cheap but others being more cleverly set up with a better payoff, but it's quite a mixed bag. Most of the scares come from chase sequences, and there's a lot of problems with the way they play out, with multiple enemies chasing the player but a lot of misleading dead ends. Also, since the areas you run through are now more open, the game can be confusing and frustrating when you think you're being led in one direction, but it's a locked door or goes nowhere. It takes very few hits to kill Blake, and the healing system means the less you explore, the more of a chance you have of being stuck at low health until you find some bandages, meaning a one-hit kill. The chase sequences can sometimes be effective, but like some of the gore, it just wears thin after a few hours when you have to start running away when you're trying to progress, and it just stops being frightening and starts becoming annoying.
What the fuck?
It's disappointing that the chase sequences make up a lot of the game when there's more interesting ideas, like hiding in the toilet stalls from the invisible priest and having to crawl under them to avoid him finding you, which is pretty intense. And the strange and bewildering scripted events that often come along with the transitions from the real world and Blake's flashback in the school. There are some smaller, creepy moments, but they don't make up for the repetition and frustration of the chase sequences. That's still one Harry Mason.
Oh God. Yes. Fuck.
Sound design. The music is really excellent, with eerie, scraping violin noises and shrill metallic strings that sound creepy and unhinged. There's a similar orchestral soundtrack that was used in the first game, but there's a lot more percussion this time round, with lots of heavy drums providing intensity in the chase sequences. There are a few select creepy traps with the glockenspiel chimes and ascending rumbles like a slowly starting machine, and also the iconic heavenly choir that plays at the end of the game. The sound effects are incredibly realistic, from crickets chirping to the sound of flies buzzing, door rattles and footsteps are also so immaculately done that it's one of the biggest benefits of the immersion. They combine with the reverb and the camera's enhanced microphone function to perfectly make the environment sound realistic. There's lots of voice acting in the game, from people reading lines from Papanov's religious text with hypnotic fervor, to the antagonists mumbling things under their breath, and of course Noth's wild preaching and Blake's comments on current events. And all of it is done really well. Noth sounds like the kind of person he acts. His voice is brimming with confidence, but it's also slimy and unpleasant.
She will bear her filthy yield before dawn. We have only these few hours to find her and kill her and save this paradise from hell everlasting. Where is she? Where did Val take her?
Blake sounds angry but still vulnerable and helplessness in the scenario he's in. The directional audio is perfectly implemented and works well with the camera's microphone. The sound design goes above and beyond, and it really shows. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. The gore is senseless, and that's its intention. It's cruelty for the sake of being shocking, and the blatant acts of barbarism committed by the antagonists of its game are unpleasant, but the player is exposed to so much that by the middle point, it's just nothing special anymore. Each skinned and mutilated corpse is shortly followed by another one, to the point that seeing entrails impaled on sticks and put on display like a decoration is nothing to bother stopping to look at. It becomes ridiculous when the population of the town and the number of shacks is dwarfed by the number of dead bodies. One of the few things that the game does that's interesting is the biblical-style blood rain that pours onto the environment in the middle of the game, which might be considered excessive, but it does go along with the biblical theme. The game keeps on presenting more scenarios to drive home the point of depravity, but it makes that point in the opening 10 minutes and just keeps going anyway, putting cribs with dead babies in for yet more shock value. The game is so obsessed with making a point that its point becomes stale. That's still 2 Harry Masons.
To sleep, you little baby.
2 weeks ago, a young woman was found wandering, barefoot, pregnant, and alone on a barren stretch of highway 100 miles from the nearest...
Oh! We lost the engine!
Story. The game begins with the husband and wife duo of Blake and Lynn making a TV documentary about a woman who went missing in the area when a mysterious white light causes the helicopter to crash and leaves Blake searching for his wife, who's missing from the wreckage. The story is hard to follow and the diary entries are well hidden, but they're the only things that can properly explain what's going on and link the first game to the second, meaning that for a lot of people the story will have no impact on them whatsoever by the time the game is over. But also a lot of the diary entries are somewhat meaningless, with letters of yet more depravity being sent from one member of the cult to another, and I personally found their backstories were just not very interesting because the characters themselves were all cut from the same cloth. Papanoth is clearly painted as the main antagonist, but he's barely in the game, and reading about his teachings just felt like more senseless violence. The game has many flashback sequences where Blake is transported back to his childhood school, and the relevance to what's going on in the modern day is once again difficult to understand. They don't add a great deal to the story in each flashback, with some feeling completely pointless, and they take almost the entire game to get to their point. Overall, the story can be interesting, but it requires a lot of exploring to even figure out, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. Outlast 2 is caught up in shock value, and its new ideas are sprinkled in so finely between ideas it overuses, like chase sequences and bodies, that you barely notice them. Its story is just hard to comprehend, and even on the second time playing the game, some sections were just frustrating or boring. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share his opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace. The Bunker is a full-motion video horror game where you assist John, a man who grew up in a fallout shelter, as he braves his past and ventures down to discover what lurks at the bottom of the bunker. Atmosphere. In the early game, there's a lot of difficult scenes and long establishing shots of the bunker itself, and it's vaguely creepy in places, with all the old computers and how quiet and empty it all is. It's very lonely feeling, and there's an eerie silence that hangs over the abandoned rooms. I found things uncomfortably strange with the isolated underground life that John was obviously accustomed to, but the most jarring thing was him leaving his deceased mother's corpse in her bed with a cloth over her face, and there's a long shot of John creepily staring at her before reading her a story, which is still the most memorably disturbing part of the game for me. It left me feeling uncomfortable, but also very sorry for John because he obviously had no clue what to do with her when she died.
A drawing I did for Mum.
As the story progresses, there's a bit of minor dread that comes along with the escalating tension in the flashbacks and John's descent into the bunker, but that's really about it. It often feels like things are building towards something frightening or dangerous, but the story tends to swerve off course into mundane territory instead, and the real danger is something relatively normal being blown out of proportion. Oddly, because of how things panned out in the story, I didn't feel a lot of fear for what was happening, as much as pity for the situation that had befallen John. As well as a lack of interesting twists in the story, there's a problem with the immersion that comes with an FMV game. It's fun to watch, but it really doesn't feel like you're really there or experiencing it due to the medium. The game also has a surprising lack of interactivity, which is just a bit disappointing. It leaves things feeling rigid and creates a real disconnect between the player and the game, which is a hurdle other FMV games have managed to clear. It has one or two moments, but the atmosphere just doesn't really get through to me. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. The scares are mostly jump scares and they're a bit cheesy even for FMV game standards. Most of them are followed by loud music cues and they just don't seem to have much of an impact, if any at all. The late game uses a lot of ghost-like renditions of characters from the story's flashbacks and jump cuts to them as jump scares, but the effects used are underwhelming and it doesn't transition into the game very well as it all happens during cutscenes. There's a few quick-time events, but they're so rare that you don't often expect them when they do eventually arrive. Sadly, the death sequences that come from failing QuickTime events are pretty weak, with most of them just fading out to a game over screen before putting you right back to try the scene again, which really makes death seem inconsequential, and the QuickTime events become a bit pointless as a result. It really feels like the lack of interactivity hurts the game here too. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The game's music is mostly electronic, with either eerie or foreboding synth pieces that feel like a stand-in for the typical orchestral style music that you usually find in horror films. There's a lot of raspy analog synthesizers that have a habit of representing radiation in the media. They work well enough, but are a bit over the top in scenes that don't seem to require the music to be as intense as it is. Some of the more important scenes have the music volume way too loud by default, and instead of adjusting it, the developers have just added subtitles, which seems like an odd fix for an easily resolved problem, though you can probably just adjust this yourself in the menus. The sound effects are of course all real from the filming process, so they're obviously very realistic. The actors' voices are captured really well, especially the governing general, whose voice sounds incredibly callous and cruel.
We'll run some tests, Mr. Bishop.
Is anyone else showing signs?
Yes, 6 others.
Quarantine them. Right away.
Mom?
The game doesn't require directional audio, and everything else is of course real. Besides the discrepancies with the music, the game's audio has a high production value sheen to it that only slips up now and then. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. The effects used to represent John's injury are really impressive, and as a result, difficult to look at. The section of John splinting his arm is one of the most hard to watch parts of the game. There's other decent effects with people getting shot, but by far the most gruesome part of the game sees John exploring a room full of bodies that seem to have decayed, and it's frankly disgusting seeing him put his hand into a bag of human remains and pulling out something that looks like lumpy viscera. The effects are the best kind of believable. That's 2 Harry Masons.
You've got to say it again, John.
You can't leave me alone, Mum.
I'll still be here. I'll always be here. But you've got to say it again.
As long as I stick to the routine, I'll be safe. As long as I
always be here.
Stay in our rooms, I'll be safe. As long as I don't go outside, I'll be safe.
That's it. Good boy.
Story. The bunker begins with John being born underground in the bunker as the bombs fall, and then it jumps forward to his mother dying in bed before another jump forward to him seemingly alone in the fallout shelter that he's lived his whole life in. It follows his daily routine until one day there's a problem with the bunker's systems and he must disobey his mother's wishes and descend into the depths of the underground facility to fix whatever is causing the problem. The game jumps back and forth between flashbacks and the present day quite often, with the flashbacks explaining how things came to be and John recalling his part in the events that led up to him being alone. The flashbacks don't really do anything original and go along with a lot of similar media following the same themes. There's a plot twist near the end that I found a bit polarizing, and the ending itself is ambiguous as to what becomes of John. The game only really lasts about an hour and a half in length, and the story was a bit unoriginal and follows a lot of tropes from other movies and games that try the same theme, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. I find parts of this game were done extremely well, but it seems like this just shouldn't have been an FMV game and should have been a short film or something similar, with the long pauses cut out for player interaction. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace. Afraid of Monsters is a first-person shooter survival horror game where you play as David Leatherhoff, a man who experiences a horrific drug-fueled nightmare. Atmosphere. The music at the start of the game really lays on an atmosphere of introspective reflection, with David looking into the mirror and succumbing to his need for something to aid his apparent suffering. After taking the experimental drug, the nightmare begins. Throughout the rest of the game, the atmosphere comes and goes, with different locations giving off different feelings of isolation, but the feeling that circulates the most is the tense anticipation brought about by the combat. The game is incredibly stressful thanks to the sparsity of ammunition and health, as well as flashlight batteries. The monsters are not only everywhere, but usually overwhelming. The game is based on the Half-Life engine and suffers greatly from a lack of refinement that would go on to be fixed in Cry of Fear, the game's successor. The flashlight in Afraid of Monsters suffers from the same limited focus that it did in Half-Life, and thanks to now requiring batteries, it can be annoying to have to sit there in the dark and wait for it to recharge. However, there's a lot of suspense since you now can't see what else lurks in the dark with you. For a lot of the game, the atmosphere takes a back seat as combat takes over, but thanks to Unforgiving and how sudden the combat is, the stress, tension and suspense that's generated along with it keeps the game going. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The majority of the scares comes from the combat. A lot of enemies have similar move patterns to those of Half-Life, but many move much faster, and thanks to the way the flashlight works, a lot of them can sneak up on you in the darkness and attack you out of nowhere. Just like Cry of Fear, dealing with enemies is the most frightening part of the game. Their designs are a bit more rudimentary than Cry of Fear, but their appearance is still unpleasant enough to be startling. The severed heads have the same moveset as head crabs and will lunge at the player, and this was terrifying every time I didn't see it coming. And being small, they're difficult to deal with. But for every great enemy moment, there are nearly twice as many encounters where the enemy's pathfinding just didn't work properly and they are just awkwardly standing in the doorway or stuck on an object, waiting there helplessly for you to shoot them. The game also throws in too many enemies in some sections to the point where it's just a chore to deal with them all rather than being panic-inducing. Whilst the stress level never really decreases as the game goes on, dealing with constant enemy attacks wears thin by the end, mostly because some of the late game enemies are just not fun to deal with at all, with some dealing lots of damage and health items being scarce. Ultimately though, I feel that most of the frightening moments delivered by the combat will vary based on the player's skill at first-person shooters and their ability to find health items and ammunition. The game also uses some jump scares and bizarre events that often pop up out of nowhere. These events are often really well done, even though they are kind of cheap. Afraid of Monsters is very rough, and sometimes the Half-Life engine holds it back, but underneath is a frightening experience. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. A lot of the early game and in-game menus play ambient tracks from Aphex Twin, which goes unmentioned in the game's credits. Whilst it does fit in and aid the atmosphere with its dark atmospheric drones, it really shouldn't be in the game, or at least should be credited. The rest of it was either original music or something I couldn't identify, and whilst it wasn't as memorable as the Aphex Twin tracks, it often provided some tension as it was really overwhelmingly loud, but not dangerously so, just intense. The very low bitrate and high compression made it sound like it was being recorded from a tape cassette. A lot of the sound effects were very low bitrate, but this was probably just a side effect of using a Half-Life engine. Some of the gun sounds were incredibly powerful and really fun to use as a result. The monsters had some great unsettling noises, but others were kind of forgettable. There wasn't any voice acting from what I remember either. The game is kind of hampered again by the Half-Life engine and its limitations in the sound design department. The developers have tried with the sound effects and they fit quite well with the visuals, but only the music in the game really stands out, which is probably used unlawfully. That's still 2 Harry Masons. gore. Blood splatters quite dramatically when shooting enemies, and it's always quite fun to see it. There seems to be an increased amount of blood in comparison to Half-Life, and the extra blood makes it more enjoyable to shoot enemies. There's not much gore besides this, but what is there is fun enough. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. The game opens up with a bit of exposition and a small paragraph of text talking about how the new unnamed drug has taken hold of protagonist David Leatherhoff, who, after trying to seek help in the Markland hospital, awakens from a nightmare to find that everyone is gone. The game doesn't really seem to have any story after that, or at least it was difficult to find by simply playing the game. Thanks to this, there's not much to talk about in terms of story. There are multiple endings, and it seemed to imply the one that I received was that none of it was really happening, but this is up to interpretation. The events of the game go on regardless, but it would be nice to know what's happening besides the moment-to-moment and what certain locations and events really meant. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Afraid of monsters can be frustrating, but it can also be terrifying. Its limitations and rough edges, however, may turn people off to the experience. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion. Horror games, if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I survived till morning, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Don't also go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Martha is Dead is a story-driven, first-person psychological horror game that follows Julia as she deals with the guilt of her murdered twin sister. Atmosphere. The atmosphere changes wildly from one part of the game to another. There are moments of serenity as Julia wanders the grounds of the peaceful Italian villa that she resides in, and moments of extreme discomfort as her psychological condition seems to lead her to the logical conclusion that she must commit unnatural acts, and she partakes in things that are nearly unbearable to watch. There's also the backdrop of the war, with her on the side of the Axis as her father is a German general, and the looming threat of war hangs over the entire game, being brought up in dialogue and radio broadcasts in the background until it's there in front of her. There's Nazi flags that hang over Martha's coffin at the funeral, and it's just unsettling to see. But really, the atmosphere is mostly consumed by the uncomfortable feeling of guilt that the game manages to inflict on the player, as Julia swaps places with Martha at the start of the game, and is perceived as her deceased twin sister for quite a long time by her friends and family. It manages to keep the feeling of apprehension and tension going for a lot of the game, as the fear of discovery builds, that her lie will come crumbling down around her. There's a lot of haunting dream sequences that only intensify the feeling of guilt, and Julia herself seems to have an extremely difficult time recalling events, and it leads to a lot of confusion as to what's real and what isn't into the late game, making her difficult to relate to. Though there is a lot of time where you're left alone in the villa, and besides a small sense of isolation, the atmosphere doesn't really creep in at all as you walk its sun-soaked environments. And the more side quests that you engage with, the less of the atmosphere of the main story creeps in. Martha is Dead layers uncomfortable themes and wartime tension over a story of soul and identity, and at the heart of it all is a player character who keeps on making things worse. And whilst her state of mind ends up increasingly apprehension and dread just to see what she's going to do next, the game spends too much time leaving the player alone with no atmosphere at all, from exploring her house and gardens to spending long periods of time developing photos. When the atmosphere is there, it's great, a near constant feeling of dread, but it's not always there. That's no Harry Masons.
Julia.
Scares. The game doesn't really have any traditional scares. There's no enemies or jump scares or even scripted events, but the game's fear runs a bit deeper with the feeling that someone is going to walk in on Julia as she does these messed up things. The fear of discovery intensifies as Julia keeps on sinking deeper. Besides this, there's the disturbing dream she has, and that's seemingly about it. Taking pictures is a big part of the game, with many sections having photo opportunities, but the mechanic isn't really utilised for the benefit of the horror. Though it's not like the game would have benefited with scripted events or enemies, and certainly not jump scares. Its psychological horror creates an intense feeling that you're doing something wrong or partaking in something you shouldn't as you guide Julia through the game, and due to the intensity of the events, it really lingers a long time after you finish playing. That's one Harry Mason. Sound design. The music is only really present in cutscenes and dream sequences, with disturbing, frantic plucking of stringed instruments and scraping noises, like the sound of an unpleasant, discordant inversion of insanity. In other cutscenes, there's beautiful but also somewhat sad opera being sung that emphasizes in moments of importance to Julia's life. There's radio songs playing in the background, and just like in real life, the music that plays is either upbeat and random, and it keeps trying to distract from what's really going on. The rest of the game is peaceful, but sometimes eerily quiet, like you're being left alone with your thoughts, with bird songs and environmental noises filling the air, clocks ticking, water running, just the general sounds of home. The sound effects that play are all perfectly realistic, and the environments feel stunningly real thanks to the dedication to recreating things so accurately. Sometimes the disturbing music covers up things like scissors cutting flesh, which is also so slick and sickeningly realistic that I'm almost thankful that it does. The voice acting is available in both Italian, which is the native language, or English. I played it in Italian, and as far as I can tell, it's pretty excellent. The characters sound emotive even if you can't tell what they're saying. The reverb is realistic, and directional audio is as good as can be expected. The sound design is immaculate, and the game relies on it a lot, and it never lets it down. That's two Harry Masons.
Mi sono sempre piaciuti I suoi quadri. Da bambina li guardavo per ore.
Gore. The game's gore is disturbingly realistic and unpleasant in the way that it's presented, with flesh being sliced through and internals removed. It would spoil too much of the game to explain everything, but they're some of the most deeply unpleasant scenes I've ever seen. They're so jarring that they're difficult to forget, and their impact on Julia is hard to understate. That's three Harry Masons. Story. The game opens with Julia being told a story about a woman in the lake who claims the lives of young women. Holding on to the story in later life, she's taking pictures down by the lake when she finds her twin sister Martha floating lifelessly in the water. She pulls her ashore, and since they switched clothes that day, her parents find her, think that she's her sister, and she goes along with it. The story is about guilt and deception, but also jealousy and cruelty. There's supernatural elements that keep on blending with reality, and it's unclear if any of these things are really happening, because of how Julia keeps on saying she's seeing things and doesn't remember events, even though sometimes you were there. Her logic and reasoning breaks down so badly by the end of the game that the story becomes difficult to understand, but the things that are told, regardless of whether they're true or not, are either deeply sad or painfully disturbing, with her mother's apparent cruelty being overwhelming in the unhinged puppet plays that Julia puts on. The game peppers in a lot of folklore and tells the story in various different ways. The diary entries Julia writes herself are the most interesting, and whilst none of them are bad or boring, the ones about her thoughts and the updates on the war are the ones that stand out the most. But sadly, where the game really falls down for me is the ending, where the player is presented with a choice of what they want the ending to be, changing previous events and making things simply not valid. And whilst this may be a parallel to Julia's mind as she chooses the most favourable story to reflect her past, it doesn't feel very good to just disregard so many things that happened, and left me feeling a bit disappointed. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Martha is Dead contains a ton of unsettling imagery in the game, and I feel it'll last much longer in people's minds than the story that it's trying to tell. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. The Horror of Salazar House is an Italian Nintendo Virtual Boy style horror adventure game that follows Elisa, a reporter who's travelled to the abandoned Salazar house to find its missing owner, a famous author. Atmosphere. The style of the game is where the main atmospheric draw is. The graphics are rudimentary on purpose, and it makes some things creepier and others unintelligible. You don't know exactly what you're looking at, and with how the old school nature of the game is, some things you interact with can kill you instantly, which leads to a lot of apprehension. Do you want to mess with something when you don't know what it is? The changing colours of the screen give off different feels, from melancholic blues and seemingly safe-feeling yellows to a mysterious dark purple and finally red. When the screen turns red, the soundtrack turns into a low rumble and there's an immediate feeling of danger. But because of the way the game conveys things, it's not always clear where the danger is coming from, which raises the tension pretty high. The game also has fixed save points, so straying too far and doing risky things can cause a loss of progress. The game clocks in at an hour or so depending on your puzzle solving skills, but death can really come at any moment. The game has a classic horror vibe with how many of the things are portrayed, from bodies found in libraries to exploring the bottom of dank old wells, and combined with the normal exploring music, it's honestly quite fun. The atmosphere when you're just traversing the house has only a minor feeling of dread, as you lie in wait for the next time you'll be chased by the murderous woman. But interacting with any of the ominous things around the house raises the tension exponentially. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The classic horror nature of the game leads to a lot of cliché moments that sometimes hit the mark anyway, with the main antagonist appearing followed by a scream as your character is stabbed. It's not original, but the fact that you can't do anything about it, how sudden it is, and the build up to it allow it to work a surprising number of times, but it's repeated so often that it eventually loses its sting anyway. The graphic and gameplay styles manage to keep some of these things interesting for longer though. The graphics make a lot of the cutscenes incredibly creepy. Because it's unclear how some of the mechanics work, you're left in uncertainty for your own safety. You can hide in cabinets to avoid the murderous woman, but it's difficult to tell when you're safe. You can only be certain when you fail to evade her, because you die. There's a lot of scripted events, and some of them give off the uncanny valley feel. Even the ones where the outcomes are positive have a sad or unsettling vibe to them thanks to the rotoscoping. Most of them either result in you leaving the area unscathed, or not at all. Other things like leading the zombie-like character around the house to look at different pictures is frightening because it's not clear why it's happening the first time, and instinctively you'll try to escape it. But unless you do what you're supposed to do, then it'll kill you. This is both a plus and a minus. Because of the obtuse puzzles the game has, it means you can be doing this over and over again until you figure out what the right solution is. The game both benefits from the old school adventure game design and is hurt by it at the same time. Whilst the horror of Salazar House has a lot of interesting moments, a lot of them are either overused or left too little impact. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The soundtrack is 8-bit and feels like it would have been played on a harpsichord or something similar. It's quaint and really evokes mid-80s adventure games, but it doesn't do a lot for the horror aspects of the game, even with its more sinister pieces. Where it excels is the tension music and the eerie quiets. The tension music manages to feel so menacing and barren in comparison to the exploring music that it feels like the game's tone has shifted completely. Its low rumbles and 8-bit drones brings things to a screeching halt, which also raises the tension to a new high. And the only thing that beats it is the complete silence that's sometimes brought on. The game also seems to replicate 8-bit tape hiss or something similar, the sound of an empty room or high-level compressed audio artifacting of some kind, and it's subtle. I can't say for sure if it brings anything to the game, but I'd like it regardless. The sound effects are also all 8-bit, from doors opening to character screams, and they're pretty unique, but they're a little repetitive. The sounds for less replayed things like water are conveyed so poorly due to the 8-bit format that they're sometimes unsettling to hear. There's no voice acting and the dialogue is done with a generic beeping noise as the text is displayed. There's no directional audio, but the game doesn't really need it, and luxuries like reverb are obviously missing because of the age the game is meant to be from. Overall, the sound design has some peaks, and what it's missing isn't something it was ever meant to have. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. There's blood splatters and other gory things in the game, but the singular colour of the rooms makes a lot of it blend in, or be easily confused with other liquids. Whilst it's a limitation that was a problem back in the day, it really makes the gore a bit of an unknown factor. That's still 2 Harry Masons. Story. The story follows Elisa the journalist as she arrives at the mansion and tries to find out what happened to the missing author, Jamie Salazar. When she arrives, it's obvious the house has been abandoned for a long time, but it's far from empty. There's a lot of little stories going on from different members of the family that are explained in diary entries and flashbacks in an effort to support a lot of the main story, which can feel a bit lacking. There's several endings and they vary quite a lot, meaning that there's a decent amount of replay value considering how short the game is. There's not a lot of story to talk about, but it's an appropriate amount for an adventure game, making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. It's easy to get caught up in the game's style and aesthetics, and the atmosphere manages to jump between fun and menacing at the drop of a hat. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. You can always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.
What the hell is this thing?
Barry!
Jill!
Barry.
Oh, Jill.
Resident Evil Remake is a reimagining of the original Resident Evil and follows Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine as they explore the Spencer Mansion in this expanded remake. Atmosphere. The pre-rendered backgrounds give the game an incredibly moody look, with many large, detailed Gothic environments from the Spencer Mansion itself. The outbuildings are eerie with their overgrown plants, and combined with the fixed camera angle setup, there's some beautiful and haunting shots placing Jill or Chris in near picturesque scenes. The music also backs up the game with spookier renditions of tracks from the first game, as well as thunder and lightning piercing the quieter moments. The atmosphere in the mansion doesn't really change that much throughout the story, but places like the coffin room, the caves, and lab area push things a bit further with more foreboding angles, cramped dark corridors, and creepier music. The door opening scenes are a tried and true classic for increasing tension, with some of them having me inadvertently holding my breath in anticipation for what was on the other side. Though a lot of the atmosphere is down to general aesthetics, tension is also raised by the enemies and what's waiting around the next corner. The addition of the Crimson Heads makes for an interesting change to the gameplay. Every zombie you shoot down is now a ticking time bomb before they become something much more serious to deal with. Thanks to the game's limited inventory space, you have to choose between using 2 slots to burn zombie bodies or not, and it raised apprehension to go through a room where you knew there was a dead zombie on the floor that you'd previously chosen not to burn. Who knows if the next journey through the room will be the time it rises once again. The atmosphere sticks with you from eerie silences to spooky looking environments, and whilst it's not hugely powerful, it's always there in the background. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. Whilst the atmosphere does an excellent job of setting things up, there's just not many cases where the game uses that tension to do anything interesting. Occasionally you'll turn a corner and walk straight into a zombie, which can be startling, and the boss fight with the snake is intimidating, but very rarely did I find these things to be scary. The boss fight with Lisa Trevor didn't amount to much of anything either, with her being barely hostile at all. The most the game does is generate panic with scenes where you have to solve a puzzle quickly, like the control room where the shark attack takes place. Every time the shark headbutts the glass, there's more cracks and the computer keeps on telling you the time is running out, but it's not clear how to solve the problem, which makes the encounter stressful. I stated in my review for the original game that the scariest thing to deal with was the tank controls, but you can turn them off in a menu in this game, which allows you to avoid zombies, hunters and Crimson Heads with relative ease. Navigating the mansion and its grounds has been changed completely with these options, and as a result I didn't find anything much to be frightened of in the game. That's still one Harry Mason.
Oh God, what did I do now? Wesker! Barry! Help!
Jill! You in there?
Barry? Get me out of here! The door's jammed!
Stand back! Grab my hand!
Barry.
That was a close one. A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
Really? Thanks.
Sound design. As stated earlier, the game has many vastly improved renditions of tracks from the original game, and whilst they're simple, the original pieces work so well at creating creepy environments that an overhaul was all they really needed, but they've gone above and beyond with what seems to be more musical passages and instrumentation in previously simpler tracks to give them more depth and emotion. Many tracks are so haunting now that it's a night and day difference from the original, while still retaining that same feeling. The sound effects aren't very memorable besides iconic things like the typewriter, turning pages in the diary, and zombie moans, but there are some things that are still impressive, like the almost distorted roar of the Crimson Heads, which allows you to identify them by sound over the normal shambling undead. The voice acting is vastly improved over the original game, but it's still working with similar dialogue, and some sentences are still a bit awkward, and characters still seem a little over the top or melodramatic. The reverb and sound environments are really well done, with a realistic spaciousness applied to all of the environments and suitable ambience from crickets in the garden to a low rumble and water dripping in the caves, which really helps the static backgrounds with immersion. There's directional audio to help pinpoint monsters, and it's accurate enough to follow Jill as she moves around the screen, but the jump cuts between changing camera angles is still a little jarring. Overall, the sound design is the kind of setup you'd expect from a remake. It preserves elements of the original whilst improving on it. That's 2 Harry Mason. Gore. The gore is a little toned down from the obvious pixels of the original game, but some things are still really entertaining, like using the shotgun to blow up a zombie's head, with bits of skull and brain matter flying out during the blast. Though the overall blood splatter from being attacked or stabbing zombies with the self-defense dagger is very subtle, and whilst it's more realistic, it is a bit disappointing to see it be less pronounced. It's hard to complain though, what's here does fit in with the darker, more subtle tone of the remake. That's 3 Harry Masons.
Bizarre murder cases have recently occurred in Raccoon City. There are outlandish reports of families being attacked by a group of about 10 people. Victims were apparently eaten. The Bravo team was sent in to investigate, but we lost contact.
Look, Chris!
Story. After an incident that sees the STARS Special Police Force Bravo team helicopter crash land in the wilds of the Arklay Mountains, the Alpha team of Chris, Jill, Barry, and Albert Wesker are forced to take refuge inside the Spencer mansion. As they begin to explore, they find more than they bargained for. The story only crops up at specific moments where you reunite with Barry or catch Wesker skulking around, and everything seems a bit off with both of them. The game also includes additional storylines for Lisa Trevor and her family, which does feel a little shoehorned in, but it breaks up the mystery of what's going on with the other characters, and even includes some impactful choices with Barry later in the game. The diary entries are just as creepy as they were in the originals, since I didn't notice much change from the originals, if any. The story manages to still be mysterious and creepy, and the acting makes things a lot better this time round, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. The Resident Evil remake might lose some things by allowing players to ditch the tank controls in favour of accessibility, but it doesn't make up for it by doing anything else. The game is still creepy, and the enhancements it's seen have really improved nearly every aspect of it. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There are more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. God's Basement is a first-person psychological horror game about a man confronting his past in a mysterious, incomprehensible space. Atmosphere. There's a low hum and a wind-like drone that fills your ears as you explore the office space at the start of the game. It's not really clear what you're doing, who you are, or what's going on, and the voice that speaks to you over the phone doesn't explain anything either. There's a lot of foreboding and nerve-wracking things, from doors creaking open unattended, to the voice on the phone warning you to ignore anything you see in the upcoming areas, and making you wait for him to unlock doors, leaving you feeling paranoid and vulnerable to something unseen. It relies heavily on being cryptic and the dark ambient music in the early game to reinforce this feeling of dread. It's not clear if any of the things you do have any impact on whether you progress or not, but the music keeps intensifying anyway.
I see you found your way to the Blue Room. I hope you didn't have too much trouble finding it. By the way, I forgot to mention who I am. Just call me the operator for now. It's not an official name, but I find it quite catchy. You're making great progress so far. We've been having some issues with the lights recently, so you'll need a flashlight.
Where the game falls apart is that some of the things you need to do to progress are so obtuse that if the game didn't have a feature that explains what to do, I'd still be playing it. It works on a timer, and the timer is so long that I'd often exhaust my options for progression before it would reveal to me what I was actually meant to do. This is frustrating, immersion breaking, and leaves the player hanging around waiting for much longer than necessary, and hurts the atmosphere badly. Sometimes you can figure it out and the atmosphere is enough to keep the feeling of dread going whilst you explore your options, but sometimes it's not enough to compensate for the boredom of waiting. Another thing that both aids and hurts the atmosphere is the operator, who at the start comes across as mysterious and knowing more than he lets on, but as the game progresses he keeps stopping you to explain the story to you over and over, and this drains the dread from the atmosphere completely.
James, it's been a while since our last encounter. That was a lot of information to absorb. I hope you got most of it, but I'll try to summarize the best that I can.
There's a great atmosphere under these things, but it keeps on falling apart by either being too obtuse for its own good or stopping the player to spoon-feed the story to them. That's no Harry Mason's. Scares. There's a ton of scripted events, from a radio being swept towards you from a dark office room to the unbearable sound of a child crying with no identifiable source. There's some sparse jump scares that caught me off guard, and a lot of ominous moments with the antagonist to keep you on edge. It tries a lot of unique things, but also the cryptic gameplay hurts the scares with moments like the one near the start, where the game's main antagonist just stands shaking in a room and you can visibly see her, but it's just not clear what you're meant to do to progress and she just stands there doing nothing the whole time. It completely disarms her, breaks the immersion and drains all the fear from the situation. It keeps walking the line between being frustrating and breaking the immersion completely. There are rooms where you expect something to happen in, and it generates so much dread that I had to push myself to enter them, but it also stops you to explain the story to you for 3 solid minutes, and this is just tedious. So despite it having some truly terrifying moments, it keeps on ruining it for itself. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The music is really great and layers these whispery, dark ambient tones that swirl up and down over the background hum that plays throughout the whole game. There's some areas where there's an uncomfortable noise like someone rubbing their bare hands on a balloon, the sound of things stretching and contorting, and it's muffled just enough so it sounds like the walls of your head are going to cave in. The sound effects are either generic stock effects which serve their purpose, or deeply unpleasant things like the aforementioned child crying and the frantic screams of the antagonist. The voice acting is really just the operator, whose voice is extremely monotone and often immersion breaking with him going on for long periods of time, and even when he's seemingly trying to be impactful, he just fails to hit the mark. He has a few ominous lines, but has a few cheesy ones too. The directional audio is spot on and there's satisfactory reverb, but most of the environments are the same anyway. Really, the sound design is pretty good and only the operator drags things down. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. There's not really any gore, and the game didn't need any. That's 2 Harry Masons. Story. To begin with, the story isn't meant to be understood. It's not obvious until you start reading diary entries and it becomes pretty clear. The story isn't bad, it's something people can be sympathetic to, but what ruins it is how predictable it is. It's easy to tell what's going to happen after just a few diary entries, but what's worse is the way the game keeps on spelling it out and forcing the player to stand there and listen to the story that they've probably already figured out. I expect they didn't want people to miss it, but the diary entries make things abundantly clear. The game also forces you into doing a tedious and needless job to try and reinforce in the player what the character is feeling. But something like this isn't going to be effective on everyone, and the task was one of the easiest things to comprehend in the game, so it kind of fell flat for me. The ending too would be more shocking if the game made less of an effort to explain that it was going to happen. Overall, the story was okay, but the storytelling made it obnoxious, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. The game is extremely cryptic in its gameplay, yet spends tons of time explaining the story to you, to the point where you're tired of hearing about it by the end of the game. It got a 2 out of 5 because it did some things extremely well, but fell over itself and managed to dip into boring in others. It's only great half of the time, which leads it to just being okay. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.
Does it get tiring? Doing this job day after day, only to come home having to care for your elderly grandmother.
Darkwood is a top-down psychological horror game about an unnamed man who becomes trapped inside a nightmarish and inescapable forest. Atmosphere. Darkwood's atmosphere is really something special. It manages to be frightening by being foreboding and mysterious. It invokes a fear of the unknown by being strange and unforgiving, and it never really explains what's happening to the forest. Spending any time exploring and there's a feeling of being incomprehensibly small against a vast enemy that you're trapped within. In the same way that Silent Hill made its protagonists feel like the town itself is the enemy, Darkwood does the same with its forests. It seems to keep on going forever, and the game's length and numerous haunting environments leave the player hopeless and at the mercy of their surroundings. Its colour palette is full of muted and drab colours, sickly greens and yellows, with the earth itself being a lifeless grey, and it makes it overwhelmingly obvious that the land has been corrupted and pushed against its nature by something. But the new hostile nature has taken over, making the whole forest seem unnatural. With the limited field of vision, you always end up feeling vulnerable since you can't see the sheer number of traps, enemies and environmental hazards that are all around you. It's a major disadvantage, but also a realistic one in a top-down game. As the sun goes down, you're forced to barricade yourself into a safe house and defend yourself to the best of your ability until the sun rises. And hearing noises outside and seeing strange lights appear in the wood raises tension to an inconceivable level as you hide from things you don't understand. It feels pointless to defend yourself against paranormal and supernatural horrors with a piece of wood, but that's all you can do. The survival elements give the game a gritty edge, and will often give you the feeling that you need to keep pushing yourself to go one step further into the burnt out building, or come back to some place hostile to open that one crate you saw. Darkwood is one of the few games that truly generates a fear of the unknown by never explaining itself or revealing its scope to the player. You aren't meant to understand. It has without doubt one of the best atmospheres of any game I've ever played. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scares are almost entirely organic, though there are some scripted events in dream sequences. Thanks to the atmosphere, the tension is already as high as it can possibly be, and for example, stepping onto an unseen bear trap is loud and can very easily startle the player. But the true horror is the realization that you're now trapped there until your character can free themselves, making you even more vulnerable than normal. The combat is difficult and makes even basic interactions with most enemies dangerous, and on normal difficulty, dying is punished by losing half your inventory at the spot you died, making you travel back to a dangerous area with less gear than you had when you first arrived to reclaim your lost things. The enemies themselves range from basic dogs to mutated horrors that scream and gurgle in pain as they throw their own body parts at you, and thanks to the wind-up nature of the combat, they're extremely difficult to deal with even something as advanced and rare as a pistol. But what the game does well is how it layers all of these things on top of each other with the limited vision, hiding in your safe house at night with horrific creatures screaming and breaking down your barricades as you try to avoid standing in your own bear traps and dealing with them before they deal with you. Darkwood layers everything magnificently, and mixing its gameplay elements over the atmosphere, it manages to create fear effortlessly without resorting to jump scares. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. Darkwood has some of the best sound design I've ever heard. The music can be incredibly unsettling but also melancholy with its selection of dark ambient pieces. The nighttime music sounds heady and twisted like madness is creeping into your ears, and the sad pianos that play as the sun rises remind that you survived another night, but there's only so much daylight until nighttime comes again. There's some brilliantly creepy dog howling noises that warbles through what sounds like an old speaker, and a foreboding track that sounds like an immense roaring rumble soaked in reverb. And each location has its own music. Though they do repeat, the music that's on offer is absolutely brilliant. The sound effects are so crisp that it's unpleasant. The level of detail in the sound of creatures slurping and crackling is frankly sickening. Lots of noises are just indescribable, and the game's sound space is frankly perfect. When you leave an area, a sound doesn't go away, it muffles and fades out until it's out of range, and it's very easy to place where something is by sound alone thanks to the brilliant directional audio. There's a lot of reverb too, with the whole game feeling very spacious. There's no voice acting to speak of, with all of the dialogue being done with text, and that's something to talk about in another section. Really though, Darkwood's sound design is extremely impressive. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. Whilst the screen flashes up red when you stand in a bear trap or are attacked by an enemy, the real gore comes in the form of body horror from the various transformations you see of people unlucky enough to be absorbed by the forest, from the mushroom men who run at the player with sickening crunching noises and laughter as they explode into a cloud of blood, to the people who have been absorbed into a tree and can't figure out what's happened to them, mushrooms growing over their faces and fusing them to the environment. The game spares no detail during dialogue to explain the unfortunate fate of people who were unlucky enough not to get away. It's deeply disturbing and difficult to read, with ambiguous drawings making you wonder which part of the thing shown is meant to be human or was meant to be human. The gore is deeply unpleasant when it's not harrowing. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. The game opens with a prologue where you play as a doctor who saves a man injured in the forest only to beat him up and rob him before disappearing. Then there's a transition to you playing as the man the doctor saved, and the goal becomes to reclaim your things and leave the forest. The game's story takes pleasure in not explaining things, and much of the backstory to the forest just isn't explained, and some things are inconsistent anyway. There's several characters, but it depends who you choose to interact with as to who you'll get to know, with some of them coming across as menacing and evil, untrustworthy, deranged, ominous, or just sad and pathetic, trying to survive just like you. Their quest lines usually involve you doing things for them and helping them find peace or solving their problems so you can get an item to progress. The quest lines themselves were often left ambiguous sometimes as to whether you did the right thing, with the game revealing at the end the outcomes of some of the choices you made. I'm not sure if there are other endings, but the ending I got, the plot feels unresolved, and many things are still unclear. It's satisfying to have reached the end, but there's an uncertain feeling that you're not that far away from danger still. The story is vague, it's clearly meant to be, but it provides such an enticing mystery with many things to wonder about, from character origins to what really started the forest on its corrupted path, that it's intriguing to speculate about. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. Darkwood is an incredibly atmospheric, intense, and unsettling game that completely took me by surprise. It's insanely impressive, and there's so many things to talk about that I don't think I could do it all in one video. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. You can always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
The world through the eyes of a god, like a dream and a flash of light. Beware the existence of mind, and grasp time in your conscious mind.
The Shore is a first-person Lovecraftian horror game about a man who washes up on a beach of a mysterious island and encounters supernatural things. Atmosphere. There's a vague air of sadness that seems to hang over the island, and it feels cold and lifeless with its grey-blue ocean and barren rocks, but other than that it's quite peaceful with the relaxing music playing in the background. There's an incredible amount of detail in the environments, from items in the lighthouse to boats washed up on the shore. Everything seems very deliberately designed to imply that it was once lived in but has long since been abandoned. However, there are blatant Cthulhu and various other Lovecraftian entities and creatures placed literally everywhere you go, from the gates with demonic fish heads on them to drawings on the chalkboard, and it removes all the subtlety from the experience entirely. In the later game, a lot of the environmental designs are ominous and spooky, with walls of flesh, black rocks, or metal structures that seem to have been crafted by an alien species, but there's a very artificial feeling to everything. From the way the game prevents exploration with very clear, invisible walls, to the lackluster way things are just dumped on the island with no explanation at all. Like the pool of unknown creatures is really interesting, but so static instead of being ominous with how little interactivity there is with it. It's just there, like it was designed before anyone had a reason for it to be there and they didn't want the work to go to waste. The game has many big reveal sections with monsters being freed, and the music that plays alongside them conflicts with the tone completely, like freeing these supposedly terrifying otherworldly creatures is some grand event to be cherished. The later game drops most of the exploration in favour of jumping the player from location to location and fighting enemies, putting simple puzzles or combat in front of them, and despite the dramatic way some things are done, it never really amounts to anything. At best, lifelessness is a feeling, an ominous sadness, but at worst, there's nothing. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. The whole concept of fear of the unknown is kind of abandoned early in the game, and it presents mythical being after mythical being like they're on display at a museum. Many of the supposedly great old ones are just sitting there waiting for you to free them, with a simple puzzle keeping them asleep or trapped, and when you do free them nothing much happens. Releasing them sets off set pieces, and they're very impressive and awesome, but just not frightening. They're relying on the design to be intimidating to the player, but I personally found the designs to be either interesting or just a generic artist depiction of what Lovecraft's Cthulhu work has always looked like. It's very difficult to be afraid of the unknown when it's something you've seen before. Besides these, the enemy combat is too easy to be frightening, and the rooms where you need to figure out a puzzle to prevent death reach into tedious before they start being frightening. The game doesn't have much to fall back on. There are some creepy moments with statues with moving eyes, and some randomly played noises that can be a little unnerving. The game also has a single chase sequence that was unexpected, but sadly over too soon. For a game based on Lovecraft's work, it hasn't really tried to adapt any of the main draws of it, except for its visual style. That's still no Harry Mason's. Sound design. The music reminds me of old adventure games, the way it fades in and out when you enter buildings. Some of it also has an old school vibe, with the lighthouse having ancient sounding mysterious drones like an old Casio keyboard's rendition of a cello. There's soft but uncertain strings that play as you walk around the island, which is very calming when combined with the waves. Some of the more otherworldly music that plays as you go deeper into the game is a bit more generic, but it is clearly trying hard to bring more atmosphere to the environments. Some of the sound effects can be a bit annoying and repeat a lot, with some of the noises the monsters make just being the same thing pitch shifted up and down accordingly. Nearly everything else seems to be a stock effect of some kind, and most of them were pretty overused. But many just left no impact at all.
As a young boy, I remember my father talking about this island. He described it in a way that would scare the listener. He spoke of black butterflies, corpse candles, and broken compasses.
The voice acting is strange, with characters that have great sounding voices that somehow sound forced. Sometimes the game's protagonist Andrew's lines are profound sounding and impressive, and other times it's just not convincing at all.
What is happening to me?
It's not important. What's most important is the exchange for coming this far. Your resilience of both mind and body is extraordinary.
Similarly, the voice of the entity that talks to you sounds pretty forced too, and a bit artificial. They sound like the same person doing voices, and it could all just be audio filters separating the two. The directional audio is perfectly functional, but there was a bit of a lack of reverb in areas where I felt there should be some. It's never straight up bad, but all its shortcomings add up. That's still no Harry Mason's. Gore. When you kill enemies, they explode into black blood, and the effect leaves a bit to be desired. Other things, like the flesh monsters near the end of the game, are designed so well that they're sickening to look at, with realistic slimy flesh. Other than that, there's not much gore to speak of, which is appropriate for the game. That's one Harry Mason. Story. The game begins with protagonist Andrew washing up on the shore, and the game sort of limps onwards from there, with a lot of references to Andrew's missing daughter and his general confusion to the situation in his voice lines. The story feels somewhat absent, with Andrew going along with a mysterious entity because it promises to reunite him with his daughter. There are a few sparse diary entries that explain previous events on the island, but it feels like they cover very little in the large amount of unexplained things. Most of the story is told sporadically through voice lines Andrew mutters to himself as the game goes on, bringing up things about the past, but it's rare and he's sometimes pretty vague with the details, which makes the timeline hard to follow. The game doesn't really explain much else until the very end, where it sort of tries to summarize events leading up to the game, but it still doesn't seem to convey what's happening very well, and then finishes with a disappointing, ambiguous ending. I find it incredibly difficult to follow or get invested in the game's story, what little there was of it, making the final score 1 out of 5 Harry Masons. The designers have clearly spent a lot of time on graphics and very little on anything else. There are a slew of problems from repetitive gameplay to failing to harness the basic concept of Lovecraft's brand of cosmic horror. The game shows promise, but it needs a lot of work. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace. Fatal Frame 2 is a third-person horror game that follows two sisters as they accidentally find themselves trapped in a cursed and haunted village.
Where are you going?
Atmosphere. The game's opening with the two sisters Mayu and Miyu travelling through the gateway to a cursed village leaves a dark feeling over the game, the supernatural sense of being somewhere you shouldn't be. The village itself manages to be both visually dead and lifeless, but also feel electrically charged, like anything could happen at any moment. It's overwhelmingly cold and empty, with most of the environment being dull greys and browns. Dust and ash covers everything, and each floorboard you stand on creaks with age. On top of this, there are just things that are generally creepy, like old shrines and rooms full of dolls, and things that just aren't addressed that you feel should be, like the body in the Osaka house or the random corpse on a shelf in the Tachibana house, that are just begging to be explained, but just aren't. Despite Mayu following you through some of the game, she does little to alleviate the feeling of loneliness that pervades the game, and it's totally helpless without the camera obscura. In fact, she usually makes things worse by saying stuff like, "there's someone here," when entering a room, making you think that there's something there that you can't see. The fixed camera angles work their magic yet again, with Mio feeling very small in the dark and dusty houses. The music also goes a long way to making things feel spookier, with jangling melodies and the same choir of ghostly voices taken from the first game, and most of the areas also have backstory tied to them, like the Osaka house has the ghost of the girl who took refuge in it when she passed over the threshold of the village, and waited there for her boyfriend to return, seemingly until she died. Finally, there's the cutscenes, which are dripping with tension and either have scratchy found footage style clips or long establishing shots which can put the player on edge. It feels like nearly everything the game does is designed to make things spookier or more tense, and it all works really well. That's one Harry Mason.
What was that?
Scares. There are a lot of jump scares and scripted events, from ghosts suddenly appearing behind the player or creeping around in the background, and none of them feel that cheap thanks to the fantastically built tension. The combat with ghosts is still where a lot of the fear is, but I find this version of the camera obscura is less clear to deal with than the one from the first game. I personally find it a bit more frustrating in scenarios where it's unclear why you're unable to deal damage. It's just very vague. The combat still hits the right spots with brilliant sound design to accompany the bizarre way the ghosts sometimes behave. With situations where it feels like you're fending off a ghost begging for help rather than it actively attacking you, and other times where they have decoys and use other tricks to ramp up the traditional combat from the first game. There's also a much larger gap between well-designed ghosts to ones that are a lot more generic and unremarkable, like the mob villager ghosts you encounter several times throughout the game, which are just boring and irritating. But there's a lot of unforgettable moments with ghosts like the woman in a box, whose entrance isn't anything you'll forget anytime soon. Her movements are creepy and her long black hair covering her face makes her seem more animal than human, and there's also the deeply unsettling ghost kids with their unnaturally pale faces. These and others more than make up for a few less interesting designs. The cutscenes, once again, are all horror movie quality with excellent creepy moments that often throw you into a combat the second they end. There's a lot of things the game employs to either spook or scare the player, and there's enough variety to keep things going into the late game. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The music for Exploring is full of discordant wails, long whispery synths, and dark ambient drones. Some are taken from the first game, but there's a lot of new stuff and it just fits right in, with ghostly static and lonely sounding pieces. When fighting ghosts, a heartbeat comes in and whispers, groans, crying, screaming, and other noises bounce around in your headphones as the battle ensues. The sound effects for the game all have heavy reverb on them, and it makes the houses feel more spacious and empty. Generally, the sound effects are once again taken from the first game, but that's nothing to complain about, as they not only fit in here but work in the game's favour, as they're still really eerie. The Ghost Radio is one of the most impressive additions to the game, and the general improvement of the voice acting from the first game to the second is at its most obvious here, with some really well designed scratchy voices expressing their loneliness, confusion, or pain in a way that sometimes seems difficult to listen to.
Come back now. Don't leave me alone. Park here. I don't want to be alone. Guys.
Miyu and Mayu's voices sound weak and pathetic, and this helps the feeling of vulnerability that comes with playing as them. The directional audio is right on point as usual for the series, and overall, if it's not perfectly functioning, then it's overachieving. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. The game has a few bits of gore in it, which is mostly just bodies or bloodstains, but there's not a lot of it as most of the horrific events happened a long time ago, which makes what little is in the game feel appropriate. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. The story begins with twin sisters Mayu and Miyu as they accidentally cross the threshold into the Lost Village, a place doomed to repeat the night of a ritual gone wrong. After falling victim to its cold and lonely world, the twins realize they must complete the ritual to ever hope to escape. The game does a brilliant job slowly unraveling its morbid backstory in the form of diary entries and flashbacks. Though it's rare to miss flashbacks, I found it difficult to find all the diary entries since some of them aren't visible when exploring without checking everything in a given room. Though you can very easily keep up with the main story without having all of the pieces, though there are some unique ones which can be sorely missed as they add to the lore of other characters. Some downsides are that the main theme of the game is twins, and the parallels to previous sets of twins, whilst interesting, can get confusing, since the game has quite a lot of different sets of twins. A lot of the plot feels like it's stalling for time as well, with not much really happening with the two girls from chapter to chapter, with them spending most of their time either trying to find each other or just generally saving Mayu. The endings might be a bit divisive with certain players based on which one you get and the difficulty you played the game on, as easier difficulties seem to result in less favourable endings. Overall though, the story combines the best elements of creepy folklore and dark rituals that made the other games so enticing, and pairs it with a more relatable story of twin sisters who have to choose to either accept their fate or break the chain of the Lost Village. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. The game is widely considered the best in the series, and it manages to improve on accessibility and voice acting, the two things that held back the first game, whilst delivering a haunting tale with spooky environments and disturbing ghosts. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
It was the first time that had ever happened. I touched the mirror and crossed over to the other side.
The Medium is a third-person psychological horror adventure game about a spirit medium trapped between two worlds, who discovers her forgotten past is waiting for her at an abandoned worker resort. Atmosphere. The Medium is lonely. As usual, the Bloober Team art design is by far the most enticing part of the game, with many of the Spirit World sections resembling Zdzisław Brzezinski art pieces. It's a dusty brown haze with an abundance of strange protruding bones that make up objects and structures seen on the other side of the screen in the real world. Personally, I would have preferred more sections in the Spirit World exclusively, since cutting the screen in half made the art design harder to see. The game leans on the music a lot, and it does a great job making parts of it feel more atmospheric, with the prominent feeling just being sadness. The game doesn't manage to generate any dread or evoke a feeling of eeriness for the majority of its short runtime. There's a lot of slow, intense cutscenes and walking sequences across ruined lands, and they're again atmospheric, but it feels surface level somehow, like it doesn't go any deeper than just the art design, pacing and music. The game has a major problem with immersion. There's so little interactivity with the environments that it doesn't feel like you're really there for a lot of the experience, and its linear nature, thanks to the puzzles and game progression, don't help either. It goes through sections very quickly with nothing to bridge between puzzles and cutscenes, and as stated, the game isn't that long, and boredom was something I experienced a lot whilst playing. The feeling of sadness doesn't really go away, but there's not much else in there either. It is undoubtedly atmospheric, but it feels like style over substance. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game has a few jump scares and chase sequences, and most of them didn't really hit the mark with me. There's some decently executed ones in the early game, but as it went on it felt more like things should have been scary but just didn't have any impact. The chase sequences especially are so linear that it feels impossible to get them wrong. The stealth sections, on the other hand, have an insta-killing enemy, and the game telegraphs what to do very poorly, especially when it deviates mechanically from other stealth sections, which left me annoyed more than anything. I felt like I was going through the motions a lot with the scares in the game, and thanks to the lack of immersion, it really felt like nothing what was going on applied to me at all. That's still one Harry Mason.
Can't get me up here, can you?
Sound design. There's a lot of droning ambient pieces to fill in the long gaps of exploring, but the really great music seems to come in the cutscenes, with eerie glockenspiels and repetitive and brooding pianos that lend a sad and melancholy feeling to the decline of their melodies. The reverb in them makes them feel lonely and spacious, just like the game. There's a great deal of dramatic tracks that almost break into post-rock in their majesty, and it really helps the art design and the atmosphere. The sound effects are kind of forgettable, but not necessarily bad. Nothing sticks in my memory to really talk about. The voice acting is pretty stellar besides the protagonist Marianne, who just doesn't feel like she cares about what's going on. Other characters like Thomas and Sadness are brilliantly voiced and emotive.
I used to think I'd never fit in. But Jack, he didn't mind my weirdness. He kept telling me I was special.
The enemy named the Maw has its own voice lines, and whilst they're also voiced very well with a lot of contrasting tones that come across as unhinged, its lines are repeated a lot since the stealth sections are when it speaks the most, and thanks to poor checkpointing you'll hear its lines repeated a lot, which means they become a bit annoying. Which isn't strictly the sound design's fault. Other than that, it's pretty impressive, a real treat for the ears. Its reverb and directional audio are deeply impressive as well. That's two Harry Masons. The game's gore is never overused and realistic enough to be somewhat disturbing when you happen upon it. It's executed extremely well. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. The game begins with Marianne visiting the workplace of her recently deceased foster father. While sending him over to the other side, she gets a phone call from a man claiming he can explain her disturbing dreams and entices her to come to the Niwa Workers' Resort, a communist-era building in the wilderness of Poland. The early game is interesting as things are established with what I thought was going to be an exploration into the lives of people at Niwa, but the deeper I went, the less the story managed to grip me, and a lot of the game was spent teasing who characters were to Marianne, which in my opinion it was fairly obvious who they were to her. It also uses child abuse as a means to an end, and that just felt awkward to be trivialized like that. The rest of it is kind of unfulfilling, with Marianne herself explaining to you the symbolism of the spirit world and the diary entries dancing around the obvious forever without ever actually saying it. The ending seemingly came out of nowhere with a justification so flimsy that it felt like a last-minute decision. The story started quite well and eventually became mundane, which is immensely disappointing. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Personally, I found the game boring. The lack of immersion really dragged me out of the moments and made the game hard to focus on since it was purposely slow to be atmospheric. The puzzles were not interesting and the gameplay felt meek and tedious. It felt unfinished, like there was meant to be more to it, but wasn't. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games. If you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace. The Mortuary Assistant is a first-person horror game where you play as Rebecca, who's recently gotten a job at a mortuary, but finds after her first day that there's demonic things going on at her new workplace. Atmosphere. One of the most obvious things is suspense and tension around dealing with dead bodies. It's so obvious that something is going to happen with them, and it's just a case of when. The unpleasant actions you have to perform to embalm the bodies is grim in itself, and the more you play the game, the more you get used to it. It takes your mind off of things going on around you as you focus on the task at hand. After the first few demonic events, you're spending the rest of the game paranoid, waiting for the next thing to happen. Really, all the game uses is suspense and paranoia, but it does it to such great effect because of the unique scares. Really, it's a circle. Something happens, the tension rises, then something else happens, and the tension rises again. That's one Harry Mason.
Rebecca! Rebecca! Rebecca!
Scares. The game uses a vast array of scripted events, from subtle things like the sound of a mortuary entrance door opening by itself, to in-your-face scares like a body running at you from the end of a corridor. I found a lot of them were hit or miss, but the game did so many different ones that it rarely mattered which ones affected you, because eventually one or two of them would. And sometimes the same one you'd seen before would work better in a different time or scenario. There's one specific event where a white-faced demon peeks out from behind a cabinet, and the first time I was at the computer and noticed it in the background and was only mildly creeped out, but the next time I was walking past it and it was suddenly in my face and it seriously frightened me. The game sometimes teleports the player to elaborate nightmarish dream sequences or flashbacks of the character's past, and these varied in their effectiveness. There's a lot of cliche elements in some of these, and things borrowed directly from horror films, but it's fun to see them added to the impressive roster of scares nonetheless. The game's randomized events lead to the morbid curiosity of seeing more, and after playing the game through 4 times, I saw very few repeating events. The problem, however, with randomized events is that your mileage may vary. My first time was underwhelming, but the second time was fantastic, as was the third. And seemingly nothing much happened the 4th time at all. It's luck of the draw what events you see and how many of them you see. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. There are only a few pieces of music in the game. One of them is an intensifying warbling noise when Rebecca starts feeling the possession taking hold of her, and a dark ambient drone that crops up in the last few minutes, but the rest of it is silent. The environment is filled with the sound of rain outside on the windows, and some subtle ambiance. The sound effects are pretty good, with a lot of them being played at random to shock the player or get them to investigate things. It's used in misdirection a lot and realistic enough to never take you out of the moment. The voice acting is pretty good, but the lines from the characters who aren't either Rebecca or a boss Raymond are a bit generic. Other than that, they're perfectly serviceable.
I'm so sorry.
What a familiar voice. Be more comforting.
Just let me...
The directional audio is okay, but the range on things is pretty weak, with things that are exceptionally loud like the mortuary pump fading out to nothing by walking just a few steps away. It's not a deal breaker, it's just a little odd. Overall, the sound design is very good, simple and effective. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. The gore is literally part of the job. Many of the mortuary processes are difficult to stomach to begin with, and some tasks never get any easier to do, but with repeated bodies it's not too difficult to get used to them. The bodies themselves are realistic, unflattering and uncompromising, with various blemishes and cold dead eyes as the game makes you do things properly. The gore is really in the background of everything else. Besides demonic possessions, you've got a job to do. That's 4 Harry Masons.
Tell you what.
What?
Why don't you go ahead and head out?
I'll take over from here.
Story. The story follows Rebecca as she's hired to work at a mortuary run by a man named Raymond, who summons her there in the middle of the night and asks her to take on the night shift. After she arrives, he locks her in and tells her that she's been possessed by a demon, and the only way to lift the curse is to trap the demon in a body and burn it, but you'll need to find its name and which one is the right one. The game's story is pretty simple, but the backstory of characters is only revealed by random events with the demons or by exploring. There are several endings and exploring them can be fun. Even after 4 times playing through the game though, I felt like I didn't quite understand some of Rebecca's past that the game was trying to convey to me, because it was mostly done but to be frightening rather than to be informative. I feel like a lot more could have been explained during my time in the mortuary, but again, there's embalming work to do. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. It doesn't do any one thing extremely well and scattershots most of it, but through that it's done a great job overall. The Mortuary Assistant was engaging enough to pull me back in 3 more times with my ridiculous schedule, and I think that says something. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion then that's cool, I get it. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And also go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. The Heilwald Loophole is a bizarre first-person horror adventure game where you discover strange and unnatural things going on at the Heilwald Clinicum. Atmosphere. The atmosphere is a real mixed bag. Some areas are dark and foreboding, others are somehow sad and melancholy, and some just eerie and quiet. But there's so many strange and confusing tones thrown in together, from the chef that sits in a soup pot and rolls around in a wheelchair, to the patient who crawls up to you and asks you to clean a toilet. The game's odd sense of humour is brought up constantly, and it leaves you confused and apprehensive as to what you're going to see next. There are patients in the bathhouse that have a haunting low poly design thanks to the graphics, and the same thing goes for some of the enemies in the game, with the overall design just being bizarre. And again, thanks to the unpredictable nature to the AI, some of the enemies don't really feel like enemies, with most of them being very polite, even if they're intending to do horrible things. There's so much uncertainty in the game because it's not clear what you need to do to progress or find a different path out of a specific area. That, combined with how the enemies react and the foreboding and maze-like areas, you never feel like you're safe. What lets this down is how often you need to retread old areas of the game to find new exits, with everything resetting when you return. What was uncertain becomes familiar, with some of the enemies becoming somewhat less threatening than they are when you first met them. The atmosphere dissipates as you get used to things, but initially each new area has its own apprehension, a sense of mystery and dread as you explore and wait for things to happen. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scares are mostly from the AI and their strange nature. From the moment you enter Dr. Randolph's office at the start of the game, there's something about the way he acts that made me uneasy. From the way his voice is a jumbled, sinister sounding mishmash of vocal clips strung together, to the text that seems to imply that he doesn't like you. If you walk away from him, his voice suddenly changes to English and he lets out a terrifying metallic bellow of "Where are you going?" as he chases you down.
Where are you?
If he catches you, he states that he means you no harm and wants you to follow him to his office since you seem ill. It's this level of uncertainty that's present in a lot of the game's AI where you just don't trust them. Even characters who are non-hostile seem to have a way of being either unnaturally weird or have a creepy design. Again, with the game encouraging you to try and find different ways of completing its levels, it will eventually render each of the enemies less threatening. There's a few scripted events, but again, they're victim to the same repetition that hurts how frightening the enemies can be. Unlike the atmosphere, the scare's potency degrades much faster through repetition, and whilst it's got a really good idea here, it clashes with another one. That's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The game's music sounds like randomly generated 1940s dance music, with things being a distorted, heavily reverberated dirge of pianos and horns that come together to make scraping noises or the sound of angry bees. The other pieces are long, menacing drones that back up the area title cards, and they're unsettling and foreboding at the same time. The ambient noises of people murmuring or the sound of rain really help the atmosphere in quiet moments and lend to the weird and sometimes unpleasant nature of the game in others. The menu sound effects are all cold and metallic, with a lot of them reminding me of something from Dark Souls. They also have a habit of being odd or very loud, with things like Nurse Heideltraut's movement sounding like a distorted kick drum turned into a horse's gallop. There's lots of gross and seemingly strange and unnecessary sound effects that all add to the bizarre charm of the game. The voice lines are all Banjo-Kazooie style, and the way they sound seems like they're whispering violently and loudly, but what really makes them stand out is how they sometimes break into English, like Dr. Randolph has mentioned before. The directional audio works great in scenes with lots of people in, like the bathhouse. It manages to feel like you're surrounded by voices. Ultimately, the sound design is strange, but works in the game's favour. That's 2 Harry Masons. Gore. There's no real gore in the game, and it was surprising, but I didn't really think that the game needed any. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. The story opens with some dialogue from Dr. Randolph as he states about a new era of research and that no one dies in the Heilwald Clinicum. The game follows an unnamed protagonist as they seemingly fall into the clinic and open a door to Dr. Randolph's office. From here, it's difficult to piece things together. There's clearly some horribly strange things going on, but very few characters seem to address it. The backstory is revealed through character dialogue and the items of knowledge you find scattered about the world in various areas, and by going through the many routes. The backstory doesn't feel anywhere near as interesting as I feel it should be to compete with just wandering around and exploring the various areas. It explains a lot of upcoming events, but the problem is the game is so bizarre and explains so little of various other things that the brief explanation the items of knowledge grant you feels like it covers nothing at the end of the day. The story did feel like it was constantly progressing, but it was difficult to see what it was progressing towards until it ended, where I was left confused. I feel like I would have understood the story better if it was told in a different way, from some brief sentences in the items of knowledge and some random character dialogue. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. I find it hard to dislike this game. It's so weird and strange and has a lot of unique ideas and executes a lot of them very well. I really enjoyed going back through the levels to find things again or try out different areas, but it directly clashes with the horror, which is a shame. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool. I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. I was going to check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace. Layers of Fear is a first-person horror game where you explore the strange, shape-shifting house of a deeply troubled painter. Atmosphere. As the game begins, the house is vaguely eerie and almost lulls you into a false sensation that the house you're exploring is just an ordinary house. The piano music expresses a vague sense of sadness and melancholy as you go from room to room, but the atmosphere changes immediately after interacting with the painting, like you've done something that can't be reversed. As the game goes on, its shape-shifting environment keep on presenting more uniquely designed and strange scenarios, from the uncanny paintings that have an almost double exposure second image to them, to books gushing out of a bookcase like water, but suspended in motion like they're frozen. The game's creativity in its art style is undeniable. The house is so dark and dusty, lots of boring wood surfaces and unremarkable bland wallpapers, and then you'll encounter a room full of floating furniture, or an impossible abyss of drawing rooms layered on top of each other like an unstable cake. Problem is that the tension and suspense is almost covered up by the surreal and abstract beauty to the house. It keeps on trying to express its strangeness by presenting more and more bizarre scenarios, but its execution leads it to becoming more fascinating than it does creepy or unnerving. It feels though there should be a greater feeling of isolation as you explore the empty, derelict house, but the sheer number of scripted events seems to quell that feeling any time it starts to build. Its environmental set pieces dazzle more than they frighten. I've never personally been frightened by weird things that also don't have an edge of the sinister or unpleasant touch to them, and Layers of Fear seems to miss that part for me. That's no Harry Masons. Scares. Layers of Fear is almost exclusively scripted events, from things like doors shutting and lights flickering, to elaborate nightmarish set pieces and in-your-face jump scares. It presents such a large array of them that the first time playing the game is extremely impressive, since it feels like something is always going on around you. Though the quality of the scripted events has a wide range and most of them leave no impact at all, but some of them are ingeniously crafted. I found most of the best ones have a level of misdirection, luring the player into doing something and then punishing them for their curiosity with a jump scare. One of my favourite moments in the game involves a bathtub and sees you forcing the protagonist's head into it to see what's going on down there. Even though it feels like it may kill him to keep on doing it, your curiosity gets the better of you as you push him in over and over again, because there's seemingly something incredible just out of reach. The game does have an enemy that crops up now and then, and if you're caught by it, then you're forced into a jump scare before being respawned somewhere else. This too also reveals that you don't really die and the consequences of doing something wrong are almost meaningless. You're just placed in a nearby room to continue exploring. Layers of Fear's biggest set pieces are often so captivating that they fail to be frightening, but most of them still succeed in at least being creepy. The game is at its best when it's misleading the player or showing them nothing. Like the room you're locked in near the start, it feels like something is going to break in and get you, and it's more effective than other scares because it's unclear what's really going on outside. But for a large majority of the game, things fail to land. So many events are just fun to look at that they are often just not disturbing, creepy, or frightening at all. That's still no Harry Masons. Sound design. The game has a beautiful selection of dreamy piano pieces that convey emotions from sadness to mystery, and these are backed up by dark, dissonant ambient tracks that reinforce the same feelings. The game isn't very long and its music tracks are often very specifically used, and work wonders for conveying the sadness in the empty house. The sound effects range from a torrent of whispering voices when you're in proximity to an item with a story attached to it, to the strange warbling cry of a child that comes across as demonic. My least favourite is the sound of dogs whimpering in pain, which is used to great effect in one particular scripted event. Other than that, the rest of the game reuses a lot of the same sound effects, but due to the game's length it doesn't matter that much. The voice acting, especially for the main character, is really great, with his disturbing stories of mutilation and glimpses into his past both conveying a deeply troubled man who's snapped in pursuit of exploring his art. All of his lines have had a nice reverb on them and with a slight hint of an echo, and it's just so clear that it's almost dreamy to listen to.
Finally, someone had to bear witness. I couldn't just look at my own work. Art and the artist needed an audience, a critical eye on things. I knew what I had to do. I gouged it, scooped it up like ice cream, felt like a butcher, a monster, but at least there was to come something beautiful from all this filth.
The directional audio and reverb are both pretty fantastic, even though reverb is barely a thing in the house with wooden floors and carpets. The sound design is, frankly, flawless. That's one Harry Mason. Gore. There's a few small bits of gore in the game, from an eyeball in a jar to a vial of blood and a blood-caked knife. which is pretty much all the game has to offer visually. What's more impactful are the voice lines from the main character, who explains how he achieved skinning his wife, hollowing out her bones, removing her eyeball, and so on. It's unpleasant to hear, but he doesn't go into too much detail about it. But he doesn't really need to, leaving the rest to our imaginations. That's 2 Harry Masons. Story. The story follows a painter who's seemingly reliving his tortured past and his descent into madness as he strives to complete a painting of his wife. The game is split in half between optional items you can find throughout the game which reveal things about his family and himself, from correspondence letters from his lawyer that reveal that he's been saying unhinged things to hospital staff who are treating his wife, to his gory drawings of Red Riding Hood that he submitted to a newspaper to an unimpressed editor. There's lots of points where you can pick up different things from traumatic events in his family's life, but many are conveyed through things in the environment, trunks full of alcohol in the painting room to rats floating in the bathtub. Some of these are a bit disjointed and not all of them feel relevant, but they're all here to emphasize his state of mind. The main story is really told through the key items that he removed from his wife's body to make his painting. The story is unpleasant to say the least, and its endings depend on your choices throughout the game, but it feels like the better endings for the painter, the less he deserves them. Making the final score 3 out of 5 Harry Masons. Layers of Fear is an impressive game for its art direction, but it's that art direction that hurts more of the atmosphere and scares than anything else. It's beautiful, and not haunting enough to compensate. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if I don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace. Nightmare of Decay is a first-person horror game where a man wakes up in a nightmarish mansion. Atmosphere. The game is staggeringly similar to Resident Evil 1 and goes as far as to reimagine its low-poly PlayStation graphics and a practically identical color palette. But unlike that game, Nightmare of Decay has a much lighter tone with talking cats and strange cameos of characters that seem to resemble famous ones from Silent Hill 2. The mansion itself isn't the same as the Spencer mansion, but it is very similar. The first-person perspective is nice for exploring, but not quite as foreboding without the fixed camera angles of its inspiration. The game opens with a news report that explains people are vanishing randomly, and this does raise a bit of tension as the situation perfectly describes the player character, but it's quickly forgotten about as the game properly begins. There's a constant low rumble that plays in the background of the game that's designed to raise a bit of tension, and it works well enough since the music is absent for a lot of the game. As the game goes on, the environments turn from waterlogged tunnels to dark caves and maze-like crypts, and it's fun to explore these places, but I found the atmosphere doesn't intensify very much as the game goes on, since it's difficult to take it very seriously with the things that happen. Whilst it sometimes can create intense foreboding moments, with blood leading to a wardrobe you can't get open, or a mysterious monster that's ominously waiting for you to talk to it, the game has more of a fun Halloween vibe than anything, with shooting galleries and characters talking like a horror version of Banjo-Kazooie. Its atmosphere is vaguely spooky in a fun way, and its immersion never really lets up despite everything that happens in the game. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game's scares often try to emulate Resident Evil 1, with zombies bursting down a door or climbing in through windows, but it also has its own set of scripted events and cutscenes, and a lot of these feature very familiar characters from the Silent Hill franchise, which really only reinforces that it's just playing around. There are some more serious ones with a darker tone, but even with that, they're not exactly frightening, just sometimes surprising. There's a few jump scares and they worked on me every time, but there's quite a lot of space in between them. Whilst the combat can be pretty intense, it never reaches into frightening even with boss encounters. I found it quite rare to die in the game, even with the added focus in mechanics of the gunplay, that slows down your movement but increases your accuracy so that slow moving zombies can still be a threat if not managed properly. There's resource management in the way that supplies can be scarce, but engaging in the shooting galleries always gave me a sufficient amount, so it's not exactly a threat unless you refuse to engage in the minigames or search the mansion. The game doesn't really manage to be frightening even when it's seemingly trying to be, but it can still succeed with the occasional jump scare. So that's still one Harry Mason. Sound design. The game does a brilliant job emulating the music from Resident Evil, once again, without exactly copying it, with sad sounding pianos and ominous droning tones soaked in reverb. The music again doesn't come in a great deal, and the low rumble replaces it in its absence. The sound effects are all really impactful and crystal clear, with lots of guns sounding as powerful as they feel, and the door opening noises being nearly as good as the ones in Resident Evil itself. There's no real voice acting besides the cult people sounding like the ones from Resident Evil 4, and the zombie moans, which again are as close to Resident Evil as imaginable. The dialogue is done with Banjo-Kazooie style noises pitch shifted up and down, which is really silly but somehow fits in with the type of game. There's effective reverb and the directional audio is pinpoint accurate, even with things like bullet impacts being spot on. Generally, the sound design is immensely impressive, and clearly a lot of effort has gone into it. That's two Harry Masons. Gore. The game's gore is excessive, with blood pouring out of enemies' heads when you score a headshot, and when using weapons like dynamite, the explosion throws body parts and blood everywhere. The game uses excessive blood and gore wherever possible, and it's really fun to behold. Dismembering enemies and watching them walk a couple of feet before they fall over dead never stops being entertaining. The gore is a bit over the top, and that's brilliant. That's three Harry Masons. Story. The story begins with a news report of someone mysteriously vanishing in their own apartment and goes on to list other similar disappearances in the area, and of course, your character goes to sleep and awakens in the mansion. The game features talking cats and shooting galleries, and its tone is generally quite light-hearted for all the blood and gore that comes with the experience. There's a traditional tale of a husband going insane and convening with spirits, and the diary entries are kind of cheesy but fun to read nonetheless. The story isn't the main focus of the game, and I feel as though the experience will be pretty much the same regardless of whether it was there or not, but including it keeps things going, and it's obviously the right kind of effort, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. I had a lot of fun playing this game. It doesn't take itself seriously, and I really enjoyed it a lot. It's light-hearted Resident Evil style romp for the Halloween night, and it really hits all the right marks. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion of horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. Always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.
I'll be damned. The engine's starting up again. Edna, it's good to finally see you doing something useful with those negative currents running through your brain.
I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream is a 1996 point-and-click adventure game where the last surviving members of humanity are tormented endlessly by a godlike artificial intelligence that conspires against humanity. Atmosphere. The game begins with a long monologue from Am, the AI who reiterates how long humans have been his playthings, and with the backdrop of a scarred and dead world, it's incredibly bleak and seemingly hopeless. There's also something deeply unsettling about hearing a computer talk about how much it loathes people.
Did you really think I'd let you die now when I've intervened every time you attempted suicide in the last 109 years? No, Gorrister, I'm sending you back to the fire so that you may languish in your guilt over and over again. This is a hell with no end, Gorrister.
Layered on top of this are the themes of the characters' differing pasts where their torturous, surreal nightmares originate, from the vile Nazi experiments of Nimdok's chapter to the melancholy sadness of Gorrister's inner decay. The game uses both the story and its grim-looking visuals to carry the varying tones of the atmosphere. The graphics manage to look dated, but also decaying, with browns, yellows, and ugly greens being the prominent colours throughout most of the chapters. In the bottom left corner of the screen is the character's face that keeps track on actions he performs, turning green for a step towards redemption and red for a step towards damnation, and sometimes seeing the face horrified at something was unnerving and gave a little more weight to the actions than there would have been otherwise. Overall, the game's atmosphere is complex, with various emotions of the game's characters and their surreal situations brought on with their own fears mixed in with the apparent decay of the world they're trapped in. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The game is only really frightening in concept, that one day a computer intelligence will exceed us and grow tired of us, that it's difficult to understand emotions will grow out of control and take upon itself to punish us for its incomprehensibly long lifespan, since we're now inferior life forms. In many ways, the game's unique in the way that it causes fear. There are harrowing moments in terms of actions performed by the player, but nothing traditionally scary. But it presents one of the most terrifying ideas, that something without a shred of humanity would one decide humanity's fate, and it's more impactful than it was at the time of the game's release. The closest thing the game comes to fear is the game over screen, where Ellen describes what has become of her in all its nightmarish horror.
I thought that with my knowledge of computers and engineering, I could shut Am down. Maybe I really am just a hysterical woman, just as Am said. Am has violated my body worse than any rapist could. I am a great, soft jelly thing, smoothly rounded with pulsing white holes filled by fog where my eyes used to be, rubbery appendages that were once my arms, bulks rounding down into legless humps of soft, slippery matter. Blotches of diseased, evil gray come and go on my surface as though light is beamed from within. I have no mouth, and I must scream.
That's two Harry Masons. Sound design. Depending on which version of the game you get, there's a somewhat limited range of options for music, with the most typical being ad-lib audio, which doesn't get across the sadness of the tracks. There's some brilliant symphonic versions on YouTube proving that underneath the tracks themselves are actually very good for the most part, but for most people, it doesn't seem well represented by the ad-lib audio technology of the time. The voice acting is quite good for the time, but it's a bit wooden in places. The actual voices used really suit the characters well, with some sounding defeated in their delivery of the lines. The sound effects are forgettable, and there's not many of them in general, being a game from 1996. Really though, the sound design is limited and mostly hurt by its age, which is an unfortunate problem for some older games. That's still 2 Harry Masons.
This must be the recovery room. This patient has been too damaged by his surgery to live a normal life. This patient will never recover.
Gore. The game has a few gory scenes, but the ones in Nimdok's chapters are by far the most unpleasant, with the surgeries he and his colleagues have performed that are just so cruel and unnecessary with no scientific merit behind them. The sprite work is grim, with the defeated looking people lying there soaked in bright red blood, but hearing the lines read out by Nimdok, a sad and broken man, that the patient will never recover is truly haunting. There's other parts like feeding a heart to a black dog and watching someone getting vaporized, but they're not nearly as difficult to endure. Overall, the gore is impactful and bleak, like the rest of the game. That's 3 Harry Masons. Story. The game opens with Am offering the 5 humans an opportunity to be free and teleports them into worlds of his own making. It's apparent to all of them that it's yet another cruel joke to test them, but there's hope in the human spirit even after 100 years of torment. The story is by far the most interesting aspect of the game, but also the most difficult to swallow, with many realistic concepts and throwbacks to events that could very well be a reality for some people. Each character's world is designed to test them, with deeply personal and traumatic events in their lives recreated sadistically by the computer for them to overcome. It addresses the cruel nature of humanity and really shows what kind of artificial intelligence would be like, made in the flawed image of its makers. The final section of the game is a gauntlet where you test your humanity, and the feeling of hopelessness pervades the whole time. Characters who saw redemption in themselves make the ultimate sacrifice to bring an end to their torment by defeating Am, and I found some of the scenes extremely sad. The game is depressing, but that is the price of realism, making the final score 4 out of 5 Harry Masons. Whilst many probably won't consider this a horror game, it was too enticing not to make a video on it. Its themes are befitting, and whilst its limitations are based around its age, it leaves a lasting impact that many other games can only dream of. Again, I'd like to remind you this whole thing is down to my opinion in horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. There will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace. Silent Hill 2 is a third-person psychological horror game for PlayStation 2, Xbox, and PC that follows James Sunderland, who arrives in Silent Hill after receiving a letter from his deceased wife, Mary.
Mary, could you really be in this town?
Atmosphere. The atmosphere of Silent Hill 2 is really unforgettable. There's a murky haze to the place. Daytime in the town feels like a sad and melancholic dream, with its iconic soundtrack and intense fog making you feel like you've lost in a past you've never had. There's a loneliness to the game. The abandoned streets of the city don't feel empty because everyone has left, but feel empty because it seems no one was ever meant to be here to begin with. A lot of the game has this piercing, eerie silence that feels uncomfortable, like you're being left alone with dangerous thoughts or trespassing somewhere strictly forbidden. The long opening walking section builds this feeling of dread in the same way that its dark and quiet corridors do. There's something going on and you don't know what it is. But the thing that makes the game's atmosphere so unique is the sadness and delusion that surrounds James Sunderland himself. From the way he does or doesn't react to things, and the way other characters react to him. So many of the cutscenes have this awkward feeling of troubled people trying to overcome their differences without understanding what each of them is really dealing with, and the pervading feeling that this is going somewhere, that James himself is harboring the worst secret of all, and finding Mary is a constantly changing and unreachable goal for a reason. As the game progresses, you seem to dive off into the deep end, into impossible industrial areas or nightmarish landscapes of torturous designs, with rooms that make no logical sense, with James diving deeper and deeper into what feels like the corners of his mind that he'd rather not visit. The whole game resonates this vibe that what you're doing is something you shouldn't, that the events unfolding around you are the results of someone else's nightmares coming to life, and I personally felt bad for witnessing it. Unlike the first game, Silent Hill 2 is sad and haunting. It's more personal. Its strange moments feel like they have a greater meaning to them, and the most confounding thing is that everyone else makes it seem like the things that James is seeing just aren't there for them. Silent Hill 2 is disturbing. Its darkest moments are violating thoughts that come up now and then to the dreamlike surface level that is the foggy town. That's one Harry Mason. Scares. The biggest change is the enemy designs, with lots of unnatural and bewildering enemies that often give you reason to stop and wonder what you're looking at. There is a repulsion to them that was missing from the enemies in the first game. From the lying figure that looks like it's wrapped in plastic, to the monsters that hang from the ceiling in the hospital. There's a natural fear of what you don't understand, and the monsters are so weird and so inhuman, but with vague human traits, that they're just instantly repulsive. Even the way that they move seems to be unnatural, from the lying figure coming out from underneath a car in a frantic, jittery crawl, to Pyramid Head with his first appearance being bathed in a red light at the end of a corridor, twitching at you menacingly. You don't even know what you're looking at half the time. The game is also fond of making you do things you aren't sure you want to do, pushing James's hand into a mysterious hole in a moth-strewn room, or asking him if he wants to jump into a seemingly bottomless pit to make you question your own sanity. In comparison to the first game, Silent Hill 2's bizarre elements are more subtle, from unnerving things like voices when you enter a room when it's clearly empty, to cryptic messages scrawled on a wall in blood. There was a hole here, but it's gone now. Its psychological horror elements mostly blend things together, from the story to the sound design and atmosphere. It's not traditionally scary, and its jump scares aren't anything special. Silent Hill 2 will still do things like place an enemy in a narrow room with you walking right into them as you load in, but its scares come more from its ability to abstract, its way of feeling wrong. It achieves being unsettling and frightening in this way more than it does from encounters with Pyramid Head or being locked in a room with horrific creatures. That's 2 Harry Masons. Sound design. The game's sound design is one of its strongest points, with an incredible soundtrack that complements every moment, from the dreamlike interactions with Angela, featuring uncertain sounding strings with a beautifully sad piano playing over it that almost chimes thanks to the reverb, to the darker and more metallic combat music that enhances fighting these horrific creatures with scissor-like slashing noises and thunderous drums. It's more introspective in places with far more somber and melancholic pieces to flesh out the game. So many tracks are used to briefly fill the gap between one feeling and another, with tracks like A World of Madness only playing in mere seconds it takes to find your way out of the graveyard. There's so many iconic tracks with haunting and beautifully sad vibes that it makes the soundtrack phenomenal on its own. The sound effects manage to sound creepy, with even the basic door rattling having an eerie feel to it. Some sound effects are unforgettable, like the iconic start game noise that sounds like the captured feeling of no return, so even the basic menu noises just having a haunting feeling to them.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
The voice acting is awkward because the people themselves are awkward. It feels off, and the way they talk to each other reveals them as a broken people they are. The conversations are difficult, and the voice acting does an excellent job of conveying it. There's enough reverb on things to make everything feel spacious when it needs to be, but cramped, with the reverb being very stunted and empty in the tight corridors of Brookhaven Hospital or the prison. The directional audio works fine, and that's all there is to it. The sound design is frankly incredible. It does a good job of being weird, but evoking familiar feelings as well as alien ones. It's creepy, nasty, invasive, and it works oh so well with the game. That's 3 Harry Masons. Gore. Shooting creatures generates a dark red blood cloud as they fall to the ground, and more blood pools underneath them. There's lots of things written in blood in an unsettling way, from the aforementioned cryptic messages to codes and other things smeared onto surfaces. There's only a few bodies in the game, with the most memorable one being covered in a grimy black gunk, and yet more dark blood, like it was attacked and killed by something horrible. The gore isn't a focus of the game, and it rarely gets in the way or oversteps its boundaries, but it's there when it needs to be. That's 4 Harry Masons. Story. The story begins with James Sunderland receiving a letter from his deceased wife Mary, beckoning him to their special place in Silent Hill. James, on some level understanding that there's no way that she's going to be there, psychs himself up in a mirror before stepping out into the lonely, foggy town. The game's story is immensely sad, with its themes of guilt and persecution become overbearing as time goes on, with so much foreshadowing that still manages to obscure itself from some players. Its symbolism in the enemy designs to represent different parts of James's psyche is impressive and harrowing to this day. The different characters' plot lines overlap each other, and when they meet there's always a feeling that one of them is exposing their secrets and desires, from the suicidal tendencies and trauma of Angela Orozco, the spiteful and shameful Eddie, and of course James himself, who often comes across as the most desperate somehow of all the characters in the game. He's unreliable with the things that he says, alluding to a darker reason for his sadness. The town punishes them all, and as the game gets closer to its conclusion, it feels like you just can't help anyone, not even yourself, escape from the things that haunt them. The story has several plot twists and works in a lot of unique ways, from its multiple endings to the clever way it determines which one you get, keeping track of subtle choices you make when you play, and each ending is satisfying and heartbreaking in its own way. Everything in the game seems to have a deliberate reason to be there. It's all working towards something, and it makes so much of the game feel impactful. The story is one of the best in video game history. Making the final score 5 out of 5 Harry Masons. Silent Hill 2 really stands atop of many people's horror game top 10s, not because it's utterly terrifying, but because it does a lot of things extremely well. It creates an atmosphere like no other, has grimy visuals like no other. Its story and sound design are refined and impactful, and it gets under your skin like nothing else. The reason we still talk about it all these years later is because it's unmatched. I hope you enjoyed this year's Halloween event. I put an ungodly amount of work into it ever since last year. and I'll be taking a long break after it's done. I'd like to point out that there will always be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching. And always go check out Bumps in the middle of the night. Peace.